It'd be very exciting for me to contemplate a Department of Efficiency headed by Elon Musk, because Musk has demonstrated repeatedly that he can take dysfunctional organizations and do the necessary things to reconstitute them and make them run properly.
Elon has talked about an assassination attempt, and it's one of the first things he said when he came on my space the first time, or the second time, was his concern for his life. A lot has changed since we last spoke. I think it was in Austin. Obviously, you got a lot more security, thankfully. The former president was almost assassinated, and you've obviously endorsed him afterwards, and hopefully will join his cabinet. So it's good to have you back.
Thank you for having me. And just a little correction, I did have Secret Service briefly, but the day that I endorsed President Trump, they took it away.
Is that part of the procedure? I don't know what the rules are. You're still a candidate, so they shouldn't be taking away because you're still a candidate as far as I'm aware.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm still a candidate. I have suspended the campaign. I have not terminated it, but they gave me a particular kind of Secret Service protection. They gave it to me under an executive order. So instead of giving me what anybody else would have gotten, which is the statutory Secret Service protection, they gave me a kind that they could limit the protection I got and then terminate it anytime they wanted. And as soon as I gave them the opportunity, they took it.
I tell you, Mario, I am going to be with the president and I have been around Secret Service presidents for many years. I have never seen the Secret Service do what they're doing for the president today at the event I'm about to attend. It is locked down. And I think Kennedy should have that kind of security, especially when he has, according to them, betrayed them and started to support the unthinkable evil of Donald Trump. I think Robert F. Kennedy is in more danger today than he was when he was running on his own. And just because he's a Kennedy, he was already in danger.
One thing that shocks me, just seeing the concentrated effort from the Democrats, instead of trying to reach out to you and get you on their side, they've done the complete opposite. The way they've censored you, the way they've tried to assassinate your character, something we talked about last time. I remember listening to their speech endorsing President Trump, and CNN just cut through in the middle when it started getting interesting, when he started criticizing the Kamala presidency. That to me is very surprising. Like, from a strategic perspective, what is going on through their head? If they want Kamala to be president, the way they've treated you does not make any strategic sense.
Yeah, I don't think they're strategic in anything that they do. I mean, I'm looking at what they're doing. Can you hear me?
Yes, that's Roseanne.
Yes.
Roseanne was reacting to you, so you can hear you. We can all hear you.
Yeah, look what they're doing with the Ukraine war right now, which is to allow Ukraine to shoot missiles into Russia and to encourage them to invade Russia. What is the strategic goal in that? Is it to create World War III? Because Ukraine is not going to beat Russia. They're losing all of the strategic things that they've done in the campaign, outside the campaign. It's all about, at one level or another, command and control. And that's what's happened to the Democratic Party.
So now what we're seeing, not sure if you can hear Mr. Kennedy, Sarah, or David, or it's cut out. But one thing that if you can hear him, David or Sarah, let me know. Can you hear Mr. Kennedy, or is it cut out?
No, he's cut out.
Yeah, you've cut out. Yeah, Mr. Kennedy, you've just cut out. I'll just send you an invite again. Oh, you're back. You're back now, Mr. Kennedy. But I want you to focus a bit more on the news we're seeing in Russia. I think this is barely anyone's talking about it. Everyone's talking about the news, what's happening in Ohio, etc. All the migrant crisis, which is obviously extremely important. But one thing that's happening that no one's talking about is now we've got NATO weapons that will potentially be used to strike deep into Russian territory. That was unimaginable less than a year ago. How are we heading there? And what would happen if we do get a Kamala administration? Where is that war heading, in your opinion?
Well, one of the things that President Trump did really right during the debate is he pointed out something that didn't get any attention, which is the role that Kamala Harris has played in the Ukraine war from the beginning. Her statement, she went over to Germany and told this story and announced that NATO was going into Ukraine no matter what. And that is the red line that the Russians said that not just Putin, but since Gorbachev, since 1992, the Russians have said, you can't do that. This is a critical national security red line for us. We've been invaded 3 times through Ukraine. The last time we were invaded, Hitler killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. We're not going to allow you to put missile systems, Tomahawk missiles, in Ukraine 3.5 minutes from delivering a nuclear warhead to Moscow. And he decapitating the entire Soviet leadership in 3.5 minutes. Ukraine for territorial ambitions, because the beginning of its takeover of Europe is complete baloney. He invaded for security reasons, and he was clear about that from the beginning, that he could not tolerate an adversary army with a country that shares a 2,100-mile border and that is 3.5 minutes by rocket from Moscow. And we wouldn't either. When my uncle saw the missiles go into Cuba in 19, we would have invaded Cuba and had a war in order to make sure that's not going to, what didn't happen. And in the end, my uncle realized something. He said, the Russians did not put this in here as an unprovoked aggression. They didn't put the missiles in Cuba, the 64 missiles in Cuba, out of unprovoked aggression. They put them in there because we had Jupiter missiles on the border of Russia with Turkey. And he made a secret deal with Khrushchev. I'll remove the American missiles from your border. You remove the Russian missiles from my border. And
I want to ask him a question. You know, he's talking about his uncle, and there's pretty good speculation that the military-industrial complex was, wanting him to die, JFK, because of his stance on de-escalation. And I see the same thing happening now. I see the military-industrial complex, because so many conservatives have at least learned the lesson of these endless wars don't do anything but make more enemies. And so the conservatives and the constitutionalists are now saying, I'm not interested in any of that. And now the military-industrial complex has moved over to the Democratic Party. They sound like warmongers, and I think they are going to start this war one way or another. Whether Donald Trump is elected or not, it may happen in days, if not weeks or months. And I'm wondering if he sees the parallel between his uncle and Donald Trump in these days. It feels the same.
yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. I don't know if you heard what I was saying, but the same thing happened in 1963 during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
We've held that quo for all of these years. Now we're putting missiles on the Russian border. We promised in 62 when the Russians took down the walls and allowed us to reunite Germany under a NATO army. They moved out 450 Russian troops from the base, and NATO troops moved in. So it was this extraordinary historic concession. And one thing Gorbachev said is, I'm going to allow this, but I need a promise from John Major, from George Bush, from the European leaders. You will never move NATO further to the east. James Baker, the Secretary of State, famously promised Gorbachev, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, since then, we've moved it 1,000 miles to the east. We've taken over 14 countries. And of course, the Russians feel threatened. This is a security issue, and this is not what we're being told. And I don't think the Russians will use a nuclear weapon. I think the reason they wouldn't, they've got better nuclear weapons than us. They've got 1,200 more warheads and missiles than us. Their electronic warfare is a generation ahead of us, which means their capacity to defend themselves against U.S. missiles is much better than what we have. I think they're more restrained, and they're the adults in the room at this point. Gorbachev or Putin has said, if we get hit with a NATO missile, it is an act of war, and we are now at war with NATO. So this is insane. There's 100 things that he can do now in non-conventional warfare that will absolutely devastate our country. They have these extraordinary electronic warfare capability, which will bring our country and our economy to a halt. It can do essentially what we did to them with the Nord Stream pipeline. We cut off their energy exports by blowing up Nord Stream. They could cut the Atlantic cable and shut down the banking system in Europe and the United States, crash it, lose all the accounts, destroy the whole credit system. And they're not vulnerable because the sanctions that we put against them have forced them to create a parallel economy. They've gotten Putin more popular than ever. The volunteer enlistments in the Russian army are skyrocketing. And Lloyd Austin famously said in April 2022, the Secretary of Defense, when he was asked, why are we in Ukraine? Ukraine has no strategic value to the United States, none. We have no treaty with them. What the hell are we doing there? He said, we're there to degrade the Russian army and exhaust its capacity to function anywhere else in the world. We've done exactly the opposite. We've made Russia stronger than ever. We've taught them how to counter all of our missile systems, all of our at him, attack missiles, all of the missiles that we've deployed against them. They know how to dismantle it. It takes them 6 weeks, they say. Figure out how to counter a new American offensive system. And they've now figured out everything.
Mr. Kennedy, I've got 2 questions for you. Dr. Peterson, it's a pleasure to have you. I think it's the first time on our stage, sir. I've got a lot of questions for you, and feel free to jump in at any time. Mr. Kennedy, I've just got 1 question for you, and then I've got a similar question to Dr. Peterson. 2 questions. First, what is the end game for the current administration when it comes to the war in Ukraine? Because it feels like constant escalation. If they're not willing to meet halfway with Russia, then I don't know what the end result would be. And the second part of the question is, if Trump is president, he did say he'll end the war in 24 hours. I think that was more of a symbolic statement. I just don't find it possible within 24 hours, but within days makes sense, being optimistic. How do you think or have you spoken to President Trump on how he would end the war?
Well, I tell you, end the war is a moving target, because a year and a half ago, you could have ended the war very easily. In fact, they signed a treaty. Putin signed a treaty that was negotiated in Istanbul with Naftali Bennett and as referee. Putin wanted 2 things. He wanted a guarantee of neutrality for Ukraine forever, so NATO would never go into Ukraine. He also wanted to protect the ethnic Russians in Donbass and Lugansk, who were, when we overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine in 2018, when the CIA and USAID overthrew them and installed a Western-friendly government, that new government launched a war in February of 2022, February of 2018, against the ethnic Russians in Donbass and Lugansk, killed 14,000 of them. So he wanted to end that slaughter. He didn't want Donbass and Lugansk as part of Russia. In fact, they voted 9-1 to join Russia, and he said, no, you should be part of Ukraine, but protect them, make them a semi-autonomous region of Ukraine, just like Quebec is in Canada, where they'll be able to have their own language and culture, and that Ukraine will remain neutral. Zelensky signed the agreement. Putin signed it, and Putin began withdrawing his troops from around Kiev. And then Joe Biden bent over Boris Johnson and forced Zelensky to tear up that agreement. They wanted a war. Why do they want a war? Ukraine, no intelligent person ever believed that Ukraine could win that war. That would be like Cuba winning a war against the United States. It is never going to happen. They're lying to the American people. They're lying about the casualties. What is the purpose of it? When Biden was asked, he said it's to destabilize Russia, to have regime change in Russia. And this is the dream of the neocons. This is the last gasp of the color revolution that Hillary Clinton and cons launched. And every one of them has failed. In Libya, Syria, Tunisia, and Egypt, they've all failed. It's the last one left. And this is their legacy project. And it is to overthrow Russia. And it's completely insane. There is no definition of victory. Every strategic choice they're making is bad. They've essentially validated his worry, which he said, we're scared that Ukraine is going to be a platform for another invasion of Russia. And guess what? That's exactly what they did. They invaded Russia. They came into Kursk, and now they're going to launch missiles into Russia. So everything that he said, all the reasons that he told the rest of the world, this is why we need to be there, are now verified and validated. The rest of the world is listening to him. We've been discredited. We forced Russia into this very dangerous alliance with China and Iran. We have created BRICS, which is now threatening the status of the dollar as the world reserve currency, the world trade currency, the world safe haven currency. And that's going to be like a nuclear bomb on our economy. And it's an absolute, there are a bunch of baby children running U.S. foreign policy, and they're dangerous, and we need to get them out of there.
Dr. Peterson, that question goes to you, and Mr. Kennedy, you'd be perfectly aligned to answer that question. Peterson, the question is, the Trump we're seeing today is very different to the President Trump a few years ago when he was a candidate initially in 2016. So looking at it, at President Trump today, with the endorsement of RFK, with the endorsement of Tulsi, with the endorsement of Congressman Gabbard, with the endorsement of Elon as well, how would you describe, because I've seen you also be critical of some aspects of Donald Trump, how would you look at Donald Trump's administration if he is to become president, and how do you think it will impact the world?
One of the things I was surprised about in the debate was Trump's, what would you say, failure to talk about his team. And it seems to me that one of the biggest selling points that Trump has at the moment is the fact that he's gathered these remarkable people around him whose behavior is, to say the least, somewhat unpredictable, and that's a danger, but whose competence is remarkable and creative beyond anything we've seen in the political domain, certainly in my lifetime. And so it seems to me that it would be in Trump's best interest to start making this about the Trump team, because that goes such a long ways to addressing concerns about, let's say, how his first administration was constituted, but also about the general competence of a potential Trump administration. And I guess I'm somewhat radical in this regard. It'd be very exciting for me to contemplate a Department of Efficiency headed by Elon Musk, because Musk has demonstrated repeatedly that he can take dysfunctional organizations and do the necessary things to reconstitute them and make them run properly. And Kennedy is obviously as radical in his way as Trump, and Ramaswamy is like that, and Tulsi Gabbard is like that. If you're a regular conservative, you might be afraid of a group of entrepreneurial people like the ones Trump has gathered around him, including himself, taking the reins of the government, because generally what you want for government leaders in a modern state are people who are more managerial or administrative in their ethos and interests. Someone like the governor of Florida is a very good example of that. He's a very competent administrator. Trump has gathered around him a cadre of entrepreneurs, and they tilt more in the creative direction. And maybe the time has come that we need political leaders who are doing that, who would take those radical moves. But it seems to me also that Trump could capitalize on what he's accomplished with regards to this remarkable team in a manner that certainly wasn't evident at all in the debate. So it's exciting to me to see that.
I thought the debate was fantastic. And I think what Trump's work has been since he announced in 2015, was it? His work, to me, the way I see it, is he's unmasking everything. He's taking the veil away from what's hidden and what we're being lied to about. And so that even for the most common people in this country, the wide middle, Main Street, they see, oh, wow, the entire media conglomerate, we say media industrial complex, is compromised, has nothing to do with telling us the truth. In fact, they're invested in just the opposite. And we all saw it before our eyes. We saw a woman, what they cheated in the debate like they cheat in every election, and it's glaringly apparent every time. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Roseanne, one thing though is, and I'll get your thoughts. Dr. Peterson talked about how Trump had an incredible opportunity, Dr. Peterson. He had an incredible opportunity to display the team that he has, Elon's endorsement. You've got obviously Mr. Kennedy's endorsement as well. It's no longer, in my view at least, and Bret, good to have you. I was listening to your interview just before this space. And by the way, treat this space as if it's yours. The mic is yours as much as it's mine. So feel free to go back and forth with the panel. But Bret, one thing you talked about is it's no longer, because you're obviously a big supporter, a big advocate of Mr. Kennedy. It's no longer about a Trump candidacy anymore. It's a Trump-Kennedy candidacy. And that is one thing that was not mentioned enough in the debate. Mr. Weinstein, I'd love to get your thoughts on a particular comment. And then I'd love to get Dr. Peterson's and Mr. Kennedy's thoughts on this specific point. And of course, Trump's performance in the debate and how much of an impact it will have.
Sure. Well, I think people are joining up with Trump because Trump's genius is being, I think that's really what's at play. His 5D chess moves are becoming apparent.
Mr. Weinstein, what do you think?
I think it's clear that we have a unity movement coalescing, and that President Trump has skills that no one else has. He has a political capacity that is unmatched, but that what is gathering around him is much larger than the MAGA movement. This is a large collection of patriotic elements that are concerned about the direction that the country is headed. And I hope that President Trump will recognize the size of the opportunity that he has, that has arrived at his doorstep. This is the time to join together, to put aside small ideological differences and to partner based on the principles that all patriotic Americans share. This is really the do or die election. And we're holding the Rescue the Republic rally on the Capitol Mall on September 29th. And I really hope that people will come in large numbers. And for those who can't, I hope they will spread the word, because that unity movement really is the best hope for the Republic going forward.
They're doing a fundraiser for him, and I have to introduce him. But thank you for all of this. I can't agree with Bret more than he's absolutely right. Everybody who loves the country has got to put our differences aside, and we've got to come together. This may be the last constitutional election, and it'll only work if people come out in droves. And I'm here today to help the president raise money here in Utah, but I have to tell you, please get out, do something, get involved, and if you can, donate DonaldJTrump.com.
Thanks, you for coming in, Glenn. And Mr. Kennedy, obviously you've been critical of a lot of President Trump's policies. So a question to you and a question to Dr. Peterson as well is for anyone who was not a supporter of Trump previously, but are also concerned about the Kamala administration, a lot of what the Democratic Party has done over the last few years. What would you say to them when they've got similar concerns to what you had over the last few months? Mr. Kennedy, I'll go to Dr. Peterson with that same question, because again, Dr. Peterson, I was listening to your interview prior to this space as well.
I've been ambivalent in my appreciation for Trump. It was my sense to begin with, and I don't think this is unique to me, that his initial campaign was something approximating a publicity campaign, which was brilliantly managed, and it always struck me as unlikely that he believed he would win, and then he did, and then he didn't know what he was doing, and that's not surprising because who does? But I've been very impressed by the Trump presidency in one fundamental regard, I would say, although there are others that are relevant. There were no wars with Donald Trump, and the wars that we have right now, as Mr. Kennedy referred to, they're insane and insanely dangerous. And I've talked to a number of people who were pro-Ukraine, let's say, and I pressed all of them, some of them conservative, some of them more liberal, and I pressed all of them on the nature of the end game. It's, okay, what's your view of victory here? We're going to destabilize Russia. That seems to me to be a relatively bad idea, given that Russia has a massive nuclear arsenal. You want the country to fragment? Is that the idea? So then we have 10 nuclear players instead of one? That might be one outcome. Or maybe you think the Russians are going to magically come up with a leader who is less pathological than Putin. If you looked at Russian history for 15 seconds, you'd understand that was highly unlikely. So I don't understand what victory looks like. Now, put into Ukraine war, if the consequence of that is the undermining of Russia's military capability for some prolonged period of time, then it was worth the investment. And I think maybe, but that assumes that Russia is actually intrinsically an enemy, which is not a story I buy, especially not when we're faced with power like China, let's say, or even Iran for that matter. We might want to get our enemies rank ordered to some degree. I don't think it's necessary for Russia to be an enemy. And I think we blew a massive opportunity after the wall came down in the late 1980s to bring Russia a lot more firmly into the Western orbit, and we failed to do that even though Europe is unbelievably dependent on Russian energy, and we're all dependent on Russian food and fertilizer. Kennedy said about the Russian war strikes me as highly credible. I think maybe Trump's having a difficult time with the Musk, Gabbard, Kennedy lineup, in part, is because the manner in which the political discussion has to be reconstituted, given the players, is really quite radical. Kennedy himself has made the general public health of the American citizenry a crucial issue, and that's new. There's an epidemic of obesity and diabetes that's catastrophic beyond belief. It's absolutely appalling. And Kennedy has made that now a major political issue, and that in itself is a radical transformation of the political landscape. It's a difficult thing to digest, and it's no bloody wonder that Trump hasn't yet figured out how to capitalize on that, or the American people for that matter, let alone the legacy media, how to construe it. And then the same thing applies to Musk's tromping with his 7-league boots into the political landscape. Like, who's wrapped their head around what it would mean for someone like Elon Musk to be in charge of making government much more efficient in its operations? And so it's not surprising Trump hasn't figured out how to message that, but man, it's a glorious opportunity. And he's got other people around him who are equally stellar. And I'll close with this. It's also the case, and this also hasn't been propagated properly to the American public, is that this entire administration is reformed Democrats. Trump was a Democrat before he became a Republican. And it's the same with Kennedy. It's the same with Musk. And it's the same, at least to some degree, with Vivek. These people aren't classic Republicans.
Gabbard.
Right, and Tulsi. Of course, exactly. And so I don't understand why that isn't being pushed harder as a narrative, especially in the face of the emergence of Kamala Harris, because it should be at least as an option on the, let's say, optimistic Democrat front as Harris. Just on the face of it, I think she's 10 times the woman that Harris is. But she has at least all of her advantages, you would think, to the Democrats themselves. And I think that's been radically underplayed. And I saw all of that as a flaw in the debate. Like, Trump didn't do a good job of defending himself or his presidency. I mean, his performance wasn't catastrophic, but Harris only had to be decent. And I'm afraid she overshot that mark. And that was disheartening, because there was much more that Trump could have said that would have put him in and his team. And he could have also demonstrated that he was a team player in a way that he hasn't had an opportunity to do before.
Talking about everyone being a reformed Democrat, Mr. Kennedy, if your mic is working, I'm going to go to you, but also our co-host, Bret Weinstein, was, and I think Bret Weinstein still identifies as a Democrat, correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously you don't endorse the Kamala administration. Mr. Kennedy, is your mic working? If not, I'll go to Mr. Weinstein. Mr. Kennedy, so my question to you is, so this is a fascinating point made by Dr. Peterson. Essentially, the entire administration is just reformed Democrats. How did we get here?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, yes, sir.
All right, let me respond to a couple of things that Jordan said. Number one, your question. I endorse Trump very simply because he agreed after comprehensive and lengthy discussions that we were going to fight. We're going to create a unity party that would fight as a spearhead on three major issues: the public health crisis, this dramatic explosion of chronic disease that is destroying our country, the censorship and surveillance state, and the wars and our addiction to war. Now, one of the interesting things that happened during the debate is that Kamala Harris touted the influence by John Bolton and Dick Cheney. And in 2004, it was basically a rite of passage in the Democratic Party. In order to define yourself as a Democrat, you had to believe that Dick Cheney was like Darth Vader, one of the worst figures in American history. He's the guy who brought us the Patriot Act, the beginning of the security state, the surveillance and security state in our country. Extraordinary renditions. He revived, or he brought in torture for the first time in American history. He gave us the war in Iraq, which was the most cataclysmic debacle in U.S. foreign policy history. So these are people who have not changed. Dick Cheney has not apologized. He has not changed his opinion. He defends all of those decisions vociferously. And when he endorsed the Democrats, it's not because he's changed or anything. It's because the Democratic Party has now become the party of war. It's become the party of censorship. It's become the party of surveillance. It is not the party my father would recognize, my uncle would not recognize this party. It is the opposite of it. It's now the party of the wealthy, by the way. I grew up in a Democratic Party that was representing cops and firefighters and labor and the working poor. The 50% of the country voted for Trump, 50% voted for Biden. The 50% who voted for Biden owned 70% of the wealth. The 50% who voted for Trump owned 30% of the wealth. So the Republican Party, you've had this tremendous inversion where the Republican Party has become the party of the poor, the working class, Main Street, small business, and labor unions. You had J.D. Vance the other night talking about the importance of collective bargaining. So there's been a complete inversion of the Republican and the Democratic Party in our country. I want to say one other important point, addressing the strategic interest in the strategic choice in Ukraine. This idea that we are going into Ukraine to exhaust Russia, to fragment Russia, to weaken Russia. Why would we do that? Russia has more natural resources than any country in the world. It has more nuclear weapons than any country in the world. And why did we make them an enemy after 1992 when everybody, George Kennan, Bill Perry, all of the mavens of our foreign policy were saying we need to invite them into the Western community of nations? And we did. We weaponized NATO against them. We made them the enemy. And now what's happened is this weekend we've been told we're going to kill 600,000 Ukrainian kids in order to degrade Russia. Has it degraded Russia? No. It has Russia has rebuilt its industrial base. It has made an alliance with China, which has the biggest industrial base in the world. The U.S. no longer has an industrial base. It exported the entire thing to China. We could not fight a war, a conventional war, with either of these countries. And now we've deindustrialized Europe by destroying the Nord Stream pipeline. We have taken away the economic advantage that Europe had, and they're paying now, instead of paying $6 for natural gas and energy, they're paying $12, $10 to $12. It shut down the entire chemical industry, heavy industry in the Ruhr Valley, and Germany is all closing down. Germany is no longer an industrial nation. It is now a U.S. military base. And a nation's power, a nation's influence comes from a strong economy. And we have destroyed the economy of Europe. We've actually weakened Europe. It is no longer a bulwark against Russian expansion. It has become a U.S. military base, and we can no longer, we're not the United States that we were before World War II. Before World War II, we were the industrial giant. We were the arsenal of democracy. We made all the steel plate. We made the ball bearings. We made the automobiles. We made the watches that could be turned into, those factories were turned into fuse factories. We built a ship a day, 56,000 planes.
And today we're threatening the dollar for a war that is unnecessary. We're threatening the economy for short-term gain, just putting the debt for future generations. Mr. Kennedy, a question for you and Mr. Weinstein and Dr. Peterson as well. And by the way, Matt Taibbi is with us on stage as well. Matt, we got to know each other during the Twitter files, which we're going to get into censorship as well, something that's not talked about enough. But Mr. Weinstein, a quote that you said in one of your interviews that I think I would love everyone to comment on. You said, "I'm a lifelong Democrat, but the Democratic Party today is the inverse of what I signed up for. It's the party of war, racism, censorship. I don't recognize this party anymore." Would love you to elaborate on this, Mr. Weinstein, and more importantly, how is it, despite you and many others echoing this sentiment, how is it that Kamala is still doing this?
I think that's actually a fairly easy question to answer, which is there's an incredible degree of information control. Not only are they able to create the impression that she's impressive in a way that she is not, but we really have no idea how well she's doing because all of the information is compromised. Buckle up, this is going to be a rough ride. But let me address your first point about me being a Democrat, another one who finds himself aligned with the other side at the moment. I've been a Democrat my whole adult life. I usually say that if you don't have a candidate that matches your values in the election, you should vote as if you're voting in a future election. I voted for Tulsi Gabbard in the last presidential election. I would tell you, don't take that advice in this election. It's too important. What's happening at the moment is a direct threat to our form of governance. And if you don't believe me, ask yourself the question, who is president today? The answer, of course, is that we don't really know. Under normal circumstances, that would be a terribly shocking realization. But it is even more shocking at a moment when we are actually in the midst of a confrontation with our Cold War nuclear enemy. And not only are we in the midst of a conflict, a proxy war, but we are actually acting in a provocative way that may lead us into a nuclear exchange. This is not a kind of power that any human being should have. But if somebody is going to have it, we need to know who they are. They need to be responsible to us. And the fact that some cabal in the executive branch behind the scenes that we cannot call in front of Congress is creating tension between two nuclear superpowers is beyond imagination. So the reason that I have stayed in the Democratic Party, though it has departed from all of the values that brought me there in the first place, is so that it would mean something when I challenged it. And I'm telling you, this is my party, but it's like having a dog that has contracted rabies. This party has become so toxic and so dangerous that we absolutely have to put it down for everyone's benefit. The future depends on us doing it, and this is the election in which we're going to have to make that happen. So this giant coalition that you find is a powerful force. And my belief is it's like none that has ever formed before. So it is an opportunity to do something we've never done, and I'm actually going to take the opportunity to push back on something that Robert Kennedy said and something that you quoted me as saying. This is actually not even an inversion between the two parties. Yes, the Democratic Party has now become strangely the party of racism and the party of war and the party of big pharma. But what is taking place over on the other side is not that it has adopted the traditional democratic values. In fact, it has simply taken over as a refuge for people who hold any version of American values. You have liberals who are taking shelter with conservatives and libertarians all under the same banner. That is a marvelous sign of hope at a moment that is otherwise terribly bleak. But this is an unparalleled opportunity to pull ourselves out of this nosedive. It is unlikely that it will come again. They are targeting the freedoms that are necessary for us to pull out of this nosedive in any sort of normal fashion. They are targeting our speech rights. And that ought to frighten us, because if those speech rights disappear in the next 4 years under Kamala Harris, then what tools will we use to build a resistance then? It's almost inconceivable that it would happen by normal constitutional means. These are not people who are uninterested. These are people who are so fed up with our system that they've stopped voting. And the irony is that there are enough of them to turn any election. If they were to come off the bench right now, they could save us all on their own. And so what we have to do is convince them that this is the moment for them to return to the electorate and deliver their message that this constitutional republic has to stand, it has to be returned to the course that it was set on by its founders, and that we're not going to wait another election cycle for that to happen.
Dr. Peterson, it's an interesting observation, and that Bret referred to again, is that the leading figures in a possible Trump administration are all Reform Democrats. It's just hard to call it even a Republican Party. It's just a Republican Party plus Democrats that no longer align with the current Democratic Party. My question to you is, we're seeing censorship around the world by both the left and the right, but mainly the left. Now, I've covered it, we've both covered it when it comes to the UK. I just interviewed earlier today the son of President Bolsonaro. He's also been on my show a few months ago. Eduardo Bolsonaro was here personally with me discussing this exact issue. We've seen this in Pakistan, India, the list goes on, Australia, and of course the US. Why? So first, is this an issue of the left that is censoring? Or is that a systemic issue that because again, I'm apolitical. Go ahead.
Okay, we're actually analyzing that problem improperly, because it's not fundamentally a political problem. What's happened, as far as I can tell, is that the technological revolution that's produced these remarkable means of communication, especially the social media networks, have run afoul of their own success in a manner that's extraordinarily fundamental. And it's a constant across the entire domain of human history that about 3 to 5% of the population is psychopathic. And we understand more and more about how those people conduct themselves. So the dark tetrad types are Machiavellian, so they use language only to manipulate. They're narcissistic, so they want unearned social credit and reputation. They're psychopathic, which makes them predatory parasites. And because that's all not enough, they're sadistic, which means they tend to take delight in the unnecessary suffering of others. We've evolved mechanisms in our normal discourse, our normal patterns of discourse, to keep them in check. Most of that has to do with reputation tracking, in that we live in networks that are connected to one another. So my friends tend to know the rest of my friends. We keep track of each other. And if anybody in that network starts playing psychopathic games, after 3 episodes, the word gets around and their effectiveness radically declines. This is why the psychopathic types are archetypal wanderers, vagabonds, because they have to invade new social networks. Now, they're always there, and they're not good people. Now, what's happened now with the rise of social media is that the psychopaths shelter behind the moral proclamations of the political actors. So that could be on the right, where they stand as defenders of free speech, or on the left, where they're compassionate beyond belief. That's camouflage. And what they do behind the scenes is continue their psychopathic games. And we see the psychopathic narcissists have hijacked the political discourse in the extremes. And the new social media networks are defenseless against that. In fact, they amplify it, because the negative messaging that these people rely on to accrue attention to themselves is more psychologically impactful than positive emotion, and we can't track their reputation. And so I think this is a cataclysm, and it's not diagnosed properly, because it isn't the left against the right, even though I think at the moment that there are certain elements of the left, partly because they've been in power in the US for so long, that pose a more proximal danger. It's the psychopathic manipulators at the edges of the political spectrum against everyone else. And that really started to become a problem in about 2014 when these new forms of technology, which are radical beyond belief, right? Every new social media enterprise is as radical technologically, maybe as the invention of the printing press, or more so. And no one has any idea how to police them, or even to identify the bad actors without falling of the censorship problem, let's say. First of all, we have to understand that this is not fundamentally a political problem. It's a psychological problem. It's the manipulative, narcissistic psychopaths against everyone else. And that's happened many times in human history. The French Revolution was hijacked by the psychopaths. The Russian Revolution was hijacked by the psychopaths. This happens all the time. And one of the most classic forms of defense of such people is their camouflage in moral virtue. Like the clinical psychopaths are unbelievably good at portraying themselves as victims. And so we're very naive about this. And we're discussing it at the wrong level of analysis. I watch X all the time. I'm watching the bad actors on the left and on the right. And I see the personality patterns. There's a burgeoning literature on this, but it's not something that we don't know how to police discourse on the social media platforms. We don't have the mechanisms evolved. And I'll add to that, 30% of internet traffic is pornographic. At least another 20% is outright criminal. And then around that, there's a penumbra of troll demon bad actors who live to produce the kind of chaos that they think they could thrive in and that accrues undeserved benefit to them. These are very powerful technologies, and bad actors wield disproportionate influence on them.
Mr. Kennedy, we've got a record number of listeners today. It's been months since the last Elon space. So it's going to be a tough question, put you on the spot. Dr. Peterson explained how complex the issue is. So my question to you as someone who's been very vocal supporting free speech, and I've been doing the same, is the toughest question to answer is how would you fix the problem that we have? Where would you start?
It's a global problem now, but I would fix it in the United States. And we have good laws and we have constitutional rights. And if the president can actually fix them, like the president can get in on day one and he can issue an executive order forbidding any official of the United States, any employee of the United States government pressuring social media companies or media companies to censor the speech. And he issue another executive order forbidding this, going back to basically the Smith-Monk Act and forbidding the CIA from spying on the American public or propagandizing the American public. He can start dismantling the CISA and the censorship industrial complex, which is centered on CISA and reaches into all of the other intelligence agencies. They operate the modern iteration of Operation Mockingbird. The penetration by the CIA of so many of our particularly liberal media news sites, and Dick Russell and David Talbot, two really wonderful CIA historians, have done separate articles and extensive research on which of our media companies, the big media companies, places like Daily Beast and Daily Cause and Rolling Stone, have now been infiltrated by the security apparatus and many others, including some of the major network media companies. But we need to also use the bully pulpit of the White House to explain to Americans that censorship is always wrong, that the president should do a speech on this, to say to the American public, we grew up in a generation where censorship, where we all understood from reading Aldous Huxley, reading Orwell, reading Robert Heinlein, reading Arthur Koestler and Alexander Sage, all the required reading were part of the sort of classical bedrock of Western civilization, that totalitarian systems always emerge. The first step is always censorship. That you have already stepped down the slippery slope toward totalitarian.
Brazil is a perfect example of that. But Mr. Kennedy, a question that I've asked you previously, and I'll ask you again because it's becoming more and more relevant. I've interviewed Prime Minister Imran Khan. Many people I've interviewed that are trying to shake up the status quo, or those in power, whatever you want to call them. Prime Minister Imran Khan he's had multiple assassination attempts. President Bolsonaro, President Trump, I've never interviewed him, but we're working on getting him on. Elon has talked about an assassination attempt, and it's one of the first things he said when he came on my space the first time, or the second time, and was his concern for his life. And the list goes on. So big of a risk is it when you come into an existing system and try to remove the unelected officials that are in power, that are making those decisions when it comes to wars, censorship, the medical complex in the US? What could be the impact from a risk, I'm going to go as extreme as a potential assassination attempt on anyone that's trying to achieve that? And right now we're focusing on the US. And is that something you've actually discussed with President Trump or anyone else in his administration, especially after the assassination attempt? Because I know you had a call with him not long afterwards.
I did not. I discussed the assassination with him on several occasions. I have not discussed the assassination in terms of saying that, first of all, of quantifying the risk, which I would not be able to do. But I think anybody knows that there's a risk. For me, it's not something I think about. I take appropriate precautions, but I would say that I have not spent even 1 microsecond of my life living in fear of that. And I think it's just, that's part of life. We had lost 250,000 men during World War II. We lost 20,000 during the Revolution. And these were people who gave their lives so that we could continue to have a constitution with a Bill of Rights in this country. And every generation has to be willing to take risks in order to preserve this experiment that America is making in self-governance. And there are risks to it. But listen, I lost 2 of my uncles in World War II. I lost a cousin at Vietnam. All of my uncles served either in Korea or World War II. All of them were willing to give their lives in order to preserve our Constitution. And I think we need that. In August of 2020, I went to Berlin and to speak to a group of people who were gathering to protest the mandates. And they were from every country in Europe. There's 1.3 million people there. And it was like Woodstock, and it was an incredible crowd. And none of them were wearing masks at a time when masks were mandated. And I was not wearing a mask, and I was in the crowd shaking hands and having contact, taking selfies. And an NBC film crew came up to me that were all fully masked. And they said, "Why are you wearing a mask?" And they said, "Aren't you scared of dying?" And I said, "There's a lot of things that I'm a lot more scared of than dying." They said, "What?" And I said, "Living like a slave, like kids growing up in a country that did not have my constitutional rights." But all of us ultimately have to make that decision.
But one thing that fascinated me is that the assassination attempt was not even mentioned in the debates, barely being mentioned by the media. Again, that's a former president almost assassinated, many unanswered questions, and everyone's just moved on. That's very alarming for me. The short attention span of people with today's social media and the algorithms putting in the latest story instead of focusing on what's important, it just makes it seem like if anyone was behind it, either the last one or any future assassination attempts, it feels like they can get away with it, similar to what happened with your uncle.
Is that a question?
It's more of an opinion and get your response to it. If it's a fair opinion, and more importantly, why is no one talking about it anymore?
I would say that President Trump, when he introduced me in Phoenix, also introduced the idea of creating a commission that would investigate not only my investigation of my uncle's and father's assassination, but also specifically and I think that's probably a good idea. I think it's always good to have more information and transparency, and the more we know about it, the better. I think it's something we should pay attention to. I now have to go, so I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, and thank you so much for doing this. It's been an incredible group of people, and it's really been a privilege and an honor to be with all of you.
And good to speak to you again, Mr. Kennedy, and we'll let everyone know when Charlie Kirk and Tulsi Gabbard, Congresswoman Gabbard, joins us in a bit. Sarah, I know you had a question.
Yes, thank you so much, Mario. My question was to you, Dr. Peterson. During a recent X space between President Trump and Elon Musk, President Trump alluded to a possible position in his cabinet with Elon Musk to potentially curb government spending. Would you support Elon Musk joining President Trump's administration in any capacity?
I think that if he was willing to take the time to turn his obvious genius to such a complex problem, that the rest of us should be pretty damn thrilled that's a possibility. Look, that man, 5 impossible things at the same time. And he has a track record of doing that now over decades. And so the fact that he is willing to put aside the concerns that he has and offer himself to attempt to do something that really has no direct personal benefit for him, except in the more abstract way that Mr. Kennedy referred to. I like daring people, and I like daring people who are geniuses. It's not obvious to me that they necessarily make the best political leaders, because in times of quiescence and stability, managerial and administrative types are probably more appropriate. Politics shouldn't be our central concern, and the charisma associated with that centrality of concern is dangerous. It becomes monarchical, but it doesn't appear to me that these are ordinary times. With the rapid proliferation of the administrative state and with the threat of war that besets us at the moment in a terrible manner, much underappreciated as far as I'm concerned, I think it's time for a little more daring on the political front than might be called for under normal times. And how could you possibly ask for someone who's more competent in terms of administrative organization than Musk? He's a track record, and it's lengthy, incredibly intensive, and also multidimensional. He's made a spectacular success, not only of a series of improbable ventures, but also a diverse set of improbable ventures. And that's rare enough. I would say he's virtually singular in that regard. So it's an amazing opportunity. And I think the same thing to a somewhat degree of the other people that Trump has gathered around him. They're remarkable people. Tulsi Gabbard fits into that category, and so does Ramaswamy and Kennedy. And so that's an exciting possibility as far as I'm concerned, and more power to Elon Musk if he can manage this. I wish Trump would capitalize on it more. It's just, I couldn't believe that was that lacuna in the debate. It's like, you have great people with you, and it's so shocking that they've agreed to join you. Who would have guessed?
Do you see more people that are much more innovative wanting to sign up for the Trump administration than we are seeing with Democrats currently?
Me personally, I think that the team that Trump has gathered around himself speaks directly to that. There isn't anyone on the Democrat side who has the independently generated public face that any of the main players around Trump have.
I think the disruptors of the status quo seem to be lining up. Doesn't matter whether they're left or right. They're lining up behind Trump, Tulsi, and Kennedy.
Yeah, it's people who are apprehensive about, who feel in their bones that something is going on at a deep level in the West that is extraordinarily dangerous. And I see that all the time, that sentiment in the tours that I've been doing. And I've spoken to thousands of people around the world and sampled the emotions of hundreds of thousands of people, and everyone knows something's up. I do think that at the moment, Trump, stunningly enough, is best positioned to deal with that. And I guess one of the things that convinced me about that was the miraculous success that his administration had formulating the Abraham Accords, which have held even after October 7th. That was a complete impossibility. And in a world that was run by non-corrupt institutions, the Trump administration people who were involved in the Abraham Accords clearly should have won the Nobel Peace Prize. Clearly, obviously, yet they didn't. And Trump also hasn't capitalized on that. The Iranians are conspiring madly to divide the West on the issue of Israel. And they're doing that extremely effectively, especially through their manipulation of platforms like TikTok, despite the huge advantage in some ways to Iran in turning the entire Muslim community against Israel in the United States, which is their clear goal. And they have every reason to do it. They know how to do it. It's been their plan since the Abraham Accords have still held. And that's another miracle that Trump managed to pull off, apart from not embroiling us in a series of pathological and highly dangerous wars. And I don't think his team has done a good job of capitalizing on that. Who would have thought that it's Trump for peace? You know, it's just an indication of how upside down the world is, but he has a track record that demonstrates that clearly. Some of the personal characteristics of Trump that I might have found concerning in a political leader, his bluster and his unpredictability, his disagreeableness for that matter. It's very difficult also to estimate just exactly how useful that is on the international front, because it wasn't fluke that under Trump there was peace with Russia and that there was relative stability in our relationships with China and even with North Korea. Trump's got that monstrous edge that might be highly necessary for dealing effectively with the mad bullies of the world. And I don't know exactly to what degree foreign policy constitutes a primary concern of the American electorate, but the fact that there are two incredibly dangerous wars raging out of control at the moment, to me is, I think people are whistling in the dark about that because it's just too terrifying to look. I have been traveling very extensively for many years now, and I've been to many countries. And recently I was in Europe and also in Uzbekistan, and I was talking to people who had extensive connections within Russia, industrial and otherwise. And I found out, I got the same story from two independent sources, let's say radically independent sources, different countries and very different people, that the sanctions on Russia have not only not worked, but they've backfired and made Russia stronger. And so, first of all, they've increased fossil fuel prices, and so that's to Russia's huge advantage. And second, it turns out that in the modern world, a relatively powerful state can industrialize over a period of about 4 years. So in Uzbekistan, which trades extensively with Russia, I saw repurposed Russian factories manufacturing at its very high quality everything you could possibly imagine, from basic construction tiles and construction equipment to high-tech implements and consumer goods. And Uzbekistan has industrialized in 5 years. The gentleman that I was speaking with, who showed me his factories, his enterprises are responsible for 15% of Uzbekistan's GDP. And his sense was that the sanctions have bolstered Russia's economic security and allowed the Russian enterprise to industrialize at the cost of the West. And so not only are we risking nuclear war with the Russians, which is not a very wise thing to do, we're also sabotaging our own economies by pushing this strange degrowth that's killing Germany and the UK, for example. And we're producing a parallel economy, could within a few years easily have the strength of the Western industrial economy, and sabotaging ourselves in relationship to China while we're doing so. Stunning. And I can't see that's going to reverse under a Democrat administration. I just don't see that at all. Whereas I think that Trump and his strange collection of, what would you say, improbable geniuses, both on the moral and the intellectual front that he's gathered around him, who knows, maybe they could do something about it.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to a number of things that we've talked about. One was the question of safety, which I don't think is a small issue at all. I spend a lot of time thinking about it in many different contexts. But I would point out that the fear that has been cultivated is the primary tool that is being used to control us. And we're going to have to face that fear if we're to find our way out of this. So I would encourage people to follow Bobby Kennedy's lead and recognize that there is a danger, that there's probably not much you can do about it. And the one thing you certainly can't do is protect yourself in the long term by hiding from it. Yes, you could probably make yourself safer in the short term.
I'm glad Bret's back here because I want to ask him, because what's interesting, is there a need for a third party when really I think what we have is one really large unified party with a very fringe left party and some people that are more conservative on the right, but it seems like the Republican Party is the big tent party. The media is what keeps us from realizing that there's a chunk of us that actually agree with one another. And I want to get Bret's take on it, because I know we have Republicans and Democrats and we have these different quote unquote political parties, but it seems to me it's becoming apparent that we have a giant American party. It's just, we're not allowed to talk about it. Is that what you're seeing?
The fact is, this isn't even new. I don't know if you've ever looked at the Hidden Tribes report. Sometime a report came out that found that we had essentially two small fringes and a vast, exhausted middle of people who agree on most of the important stuff, even the stuff that we're told we can't agree on, like reproductive rights. It turns out that most of us are in basic agreement about them. So yes, the control is maintained by leading us to fight each other when in fact what unites us far exceeds what divides us. But I would encourage you to rethink your sense of the parties. Something has happened. The blue team has been taken over by something utterly unholy. We've just seen what I think is provably a coup right in front of our eyes. We don't know who the president is, and the person on the blue team who's running for president is complicit, forced the president out of the race by invoking the 25th Amendment, but leaves him in the office and does not invoke the 25th Amendment. what exactly is going on here? This has nothing to do with the system that was outlined by our founders. So the blue team isn't really a political party in the traditional sense. It's some kind of cabal that has taken control. And then what's happening over on the red side doesn't look like any Republican Party that I'm familiar with over the course of the last 5 decades. It looks totally different, and it has accumulated a absolutely huge and radically diverse coalition of people. That's a brand new feature on this political landscape. And I would encourage you in thinking about what the Republican Party is, although it contains elements that are holdovers from the Republican Party of 10 years ago, it is more different than it is similar. That much is clear. I've in fact encouraged that maybe we should be thinking of it as the grand new party. And you're absolutely right. What it is, it's a very big tent that we're pitching, and it happens to be under a color that we all have connotations with. But it's a new phenomenon. What we really need, I think, as your comment alluded to, is a second party. In that vein, I would point out that we have with us my good friend, Angela McArdle, who many of you will know and some of you will not be familiar, is the head of the National Libertarian Party. She has been, I don't want to say co-conspirator, that would obviously be a joke, but you never know who's listening and how they're going to portray this. Anyway, I want Angela to talk to us about not only how this looks from the point of view of liberals and conservatives, but from her very different, very important faction. Is the Libertarian Party the next second party?
And Angela, I'd love your take on this. And as I give you the mic as well, I do want to give a massive welcome as well to Matt Taibbi. We're going to go to you shortly, Matt, one of my favorite journalists since the Twitter files. I'd love to get your perspective on the discussion now, since we're getting into the control of free speech. Angela, pleasure to have you. I think it's the first time on stage. Please do go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back. Maybe I can tee this question up for Matt, who is graciously speaking at our event and has been helping us out with our quote unquote conspiring. You know, as chair of a national political party, I've taken a great risk and quite a bit of heat in organizing this movement. But I really do think we have to unite and take a leap of faith and trust each other. And, you know, also hope one of us doesn't turn out to be a snake, right? Because it's difficult unifying. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek. It's difficult because we don't align perfectly. But I really think we have to work together where we can in order to preserve individual rights and Western values like free speech, property rights, upward economic mobility, the things that make people want to come to America. And it's a risk to trust each other. But at this point in time, I think it's a greater risk to not trust each other and to end up being devoured by the snakes and deep state operatives that are out there trying to tank the country. And that's essentially why I've worked with Bret to organize Rescue the Republic, because we, the people who are not cheering on assassination attempts, who don't want to live in a pod and eat bugs, I think we need to band together and push back against this murderous regime and the murderous ideology that's behind it. And Bret and I struggled to articulate perfectly what we are pushing back against. We talked about all these different industrial complexes, which I feel like is the best way that we could really articulate it. But even more so than articulating and describing our enemy, I wonder, is there something more fitting or precise, a more precise way to describe this movement besides unity? Because I think what we're putting together right now is really powerful.
And Matt, pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Mario. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Angela, for the question. And thank you also for the event. I'm really looking forward to it. Put a lot of thought into it. As to that question, how do you describe it? It's been interesting listening to everyone tonight. Bret talking about the great exhausted middle. Mr. Kennedy talking about how he doesn't recognize the Democratic Party and the rite of passage that everybody thought that Dick Cheney was Darth Vader and suddenly everybody believing the inverse. It's amazing. And the question is, what happened? And I think the particular lens that I had to look at this through in the last few years as a reporter has been clarifying in this respect. Censorship is probably the one issue that helps explain the transformation of American partisan politics. When we first started working on the Twitter files, in the first couple of days, the first things we saw were these emails that said things like flagged by DHS and flagged by FBI. And when we started looking at it very quickly, we discovered there was this elaborate funded series of government bureaucracies that watch the internet. Were very interested in controlling information. So the immediate question was, what are these bureaucracies? What are their origins? And we found that a lot of them had begun right after 9/11 and had their roots were as counter-terrorist operations overseas. So a good example is the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, which is also called GEC. It used to be called the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. It was originally designed to counter the message of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They were funded to solve the problem of foreign Islamists recruiting middle and upper class kids in the suburbs of London and New York. But over time, and then especially after Brexit and then Donald Trump's election, these organizations morphed into inward, and they acquired a new mission. First head of GEC was the former editor of Time, Rick Stengel. And in his book, he wrote about how he had this light bulb moment when he realized, and this is a quote, Trump employed the same techniques of disinformation as the Russians and the same scare tactics to attack ISIS. So basically, at that point, a lot of these organizations, they began to look at their own domestic populations in the same light that they had looked at the terrorist enemy previously. And one source described the change to me as CT to CP, which is counterterrorism to counterpopulism. Everybody's trying to give a name to what this new coalition is, and I just think the coalition is everybody. These groups, basically, this very small number of people who are managing these very powerful military and surveillance bureaucracies, among other things, they now see the domestic population and voting, people who are prone to thinking about removing them from office, as threats. It's like the Terminator, right? It's basically the same story. And so
how do they deal, and this question I asked Dr. Peterson, I think earlier, but how do they deal, in your opinion, with these threats? Like, you've covered it extensively when it comes to free speech, censoring them, controlling the narrative. That's one way of dealing with it. Maybe I can pivot to asking you about the assassination, the attempted assassination on President Trump. What are your personal thoughts on these events and why no one's talking about it today?
I don't know that we have a ton of information to go on that would suggest any kind of government involvement beyond maybe the possibility of intentionally bad security. What I will say, though, is that it's very conspicuous, the kind of lawfare efforts leading up to the assassination, the lack of coverage of the assassination, all those things, the attempts to prosecute your political enemies. We had an extraordinary run of things happen just in the last few weeks. We had raids on the houses of people like Scott Ritter, and then there was an ex-Soviet analyst named Dmitry Simes, who used to be considered a middle-of-the-road conservative analyst, and the FBI goes into his house, freezes his accounts because they don't like what he says about the war in Ukraine. There's just this comprehensive, holistic effort from speech to the weaponization of the Justice Ministry to think about it. We've been in this post 9/11 war on terror environment where we've steadily had our rights chipped away at, from the 8th Amendment to the 5th Amendment to the 4th Amendment to the First Amendment now. And we've been like frogs in boiling water, and they're just going to keep hacking away.
It's like a dangerous path to a dystopia. Dr. Peterson, what would you say is your biggest concern out of, I'd say, the three main weapons that whoever's in power in any country really we're focusing on the US would be censorship or controlling the speech, lawfare, and maybe a weaker weapon to have is just character assassination, as we've seen with Mr. Kennedy. Which of these, and is there any other weapons that you put into that arsenal? Which one do you think is the most concerning as society slowly boils like a frog?
I've been the personal recipient of all three of those in Canada, and that's happened in a manner that I wouldn't have really thought possible in my home country. My license to practice as a clinical psychologist is under serious threat and has been for 10 years. And in some ways, the pressure on that front just continues to mount. And what is that? Is that exactly coming from the government down? It is to some degree, but I actually think that it's the corruption of the universities that's behind it, since they're upstream from almost all positions of authority and power. And we've seen a pronounced shift in the manner in which the universities conduct themselves, especially in the humanities and social science space. And that's been accelerating over a 30-year period. And it hits something like critical volume in the mid 2010s and has polluted the space of public discourse in a terrible way ever since. I still think about it in some ways as the biggest danger because, well, the source is polluted, and so everything that runs downstream from it is becoming increasingly corrupt. The bureaucrats in Canada, for example, who are threatening my license, my livelihood, my reputation, and my finances are mid-level bureaucrats who are quasi-educated, and they don't seem to have any concern whatsoever for classic Western freedoms, and certainly very little concern for classic Western civilization as such. And it's not surprising because they've been educated in that belief or anti-belief their entire life. You know, we didn't necessarily expect that the next wave of tyranny would be a consequence of action at the mid-level bureaucracy, but that seems to be what's happening. But I think, like I said, a huge part of that's attributable to the universities. Of course, Bret was the unhappy recipient of the same kind of treatment in the United States.
Seems like a lifetime ago. Jordan got most of the way there in his last comment, but at some level, we are dancing around a frightening recognition that something which is hostile to all of the values and protections that allow the West to function has gotten control over not just one of the governments of Western countries, but seemingly all of them simultaneously. And that is a much bigger threat than even the failure of any one nation, no matter how important. So that's really what we're looking at. And frankly, the evidence isn't even all that hard to put together. It's not some remote concept. It's plainly obvious if you just simply look at the fact that speech rights are failing across Western Europe, and they're failing at the same time in the US. Europe has an immigration crisis that just so happens to be mirrored by one here in North America. This is something that has taken control of our system and has turned all of the institutions that would ordinarily protect it against the interests of the public.
Let me give you some figures because you're talking about how this is becoming a global problem. The 5 biggest democracies by population size, India's number 1. I think we all know what's going on with the Modi government and the issues they've had with X, who's trying to resist a lot of censorship requests. The United States is number 2, which we've talked about extensively. Number 3 is Indonesia, which they've got their own problems there. We haven't dug into it enough, so I won't comment there. Pakistan's number 4. The military pretty much controls everything in that country, and X has been banned in that country. Brazil is number 5, and we obviously have had Eduardo Bolsonaro on my show earlier today, and we all know what happened in Brazil, and X is still banned in Brazil. The bank accounts have been unfrozen, but the platform is still banned. So it is becoming a global problem. But then Bret, Dr. Peterson, and obviously Angela and Matt, I'll go with you, Bret, first, and then Dr. Peterson, do you think a Trump administration is enough to reverse what I would call like a slow and dangerous path towards controlled speech? Immigration issues, all these problems are always dominating headlines, but no one talks about the dangers of controlled speech, controlled narrative, or where that could lead the world, especially with everyone having their identity online now. So essentially being canceled on all these social media platforms, you no longer have a voice. It's almost like you lost your passport and your phone and any sort of communication with the outside world. But the question is, Dr. Peterson, do you think a Trump administration with Tulsi Gabbard, with RFK, with Elon, is that enough?
The answer to your question is it damn well better be. And I think there's reason to hope that it might be, but we don't have a better alternative. And I would also just turn the question on its head. The people who have targeted our speech rights are focused on this issue for exactly the same reason that we should be. This is the essential tool necessary to repel their advance. And if we lose it, we are in a whole different world. This is the sign that we are not imagining an attack on all Western values. This is the last piece that remains for us to defend them. Here's the crucial part of the answer to your question. Why might a Trump administration be in a position to repel this advance? And the answer is what we are up against, whatever its nature might be, that seems to be housed over in the DNC. That thing has tormented and driven from all of our institutions all of the competent, patriotic, insightful people. Those people are now gathering together around Donald Trump, as unlikely as that would have seemed to many of us even just a few years ago. But the fact that group is gathering in one place gives us the best shot that we have to repel this advance. We are now dealing with a need to triage the problem. It's all well and good to ask, what are you going to do about this problem? And what are you going to do about that problem should you find that your administration is elected? But really, the question isn't what is going to be done. It's who is going to be put in a position to sort out how to address the problem. I've never met anybody who knows more about the problem. And if there is a way to address it, he's the guy to find it. So what we want is to see that same logic applied across all of the critical failures of Western civilization. Who are we going to put on the job? Should Elon Musk be the guy to figure out where government is a wasteful disposal engine for our wealth? Yeah, I think he's a great person for it. If he'll take the job, let's put him on it. And if Trump will simply see his job as managing this large coalition and figuring out who among all of those highly capable people is best positioned for each of the problems we face, I think we've got a pretty good shot.
Have you endorsed President Trump or not?
I haven't formally endorsed him, but I will tell you right now, I certainly intend to vote for him. Now, the reason I haven't formally endorsed him is that there is a lot of to go, but there's no part of me that is holding out for a better alternative. I think we've got our alternative, and it is that coalition, and Donald Trump is the guy at the head of it, and I will vote for him unflinchingly. I guess that's a little different than a formal endorsement, but it's not substantially different.
That's a pretty direct answer. I appreciate it. Dr. Peterson, it's going back to the question, unless you have other comments, but mainly the question of a Trump administration, and that includes everyone that we've talked about. Would that be enough to counter that path that we're heading down, mainly focusing on controlling speech? And do you think it will have much impact? Because I know you cover, and me too, but we cover censorship around the world. For our global audience, do you think a new Trump administration with Elon, with Kennedy, with Gabbard, do you think that will be enough to counter that shift to censorship around the world, including Brazil, Pakistan, Europe, which is a major problem, Canada? Or
well, I don't think it has to be enough in some ways, because I think the situation is in some ways like it's crucial but critical, but it's not as dire as it might be. Because, well, for example, there's every bit of evidence in Canada that the Trudeau government, which was on the forefront of some of this woke nonsense that we've been commenting about today, this globalist utopian totalitarian danger, he'll be lucky in the next election if his party maintains viable party status. He's going to get decimated. And the person who's going to replace him, Pierre Poilievre, is a reliable conservative type of the populist conservative type that now seems to be emerging. And there's every sign of that sort of thing happening in Europe too. It's not like the Scandinavian countries have got off their rocker. And Italy has a pretty competent government. And the Eastern Europeans are firmly aligned with the US, and they're staunch free speech advocates, having had 70 years of Soviet totalitarianism to contend with. It is the case that the American public itself agrees with a kind of 90% plurality on almost all major issues, including the ones that hypothetically divide us so badly. And so I think the problem we're facing is actually tied into the psychological issues that I described earlier, is that these new communication technologies have made the public discourse space much more amenable to takeover by bad actors. And they're the psychopathic narcissist types. And what they're essentially using is a victim-victimizer narrative to obtain control. And that's a very old story. Societies are always threatened by the resentful, envious, bitter types who are enraged and shake their fist at the sky because their pathway through life hasn't garnered to them the same benefits that might have come to the more deserving. And it's always a catastrophe when they get the upper hand. And that is what's happening. But that doesn't mean that the rot, it's not fluke that it's the average American citizen that sees through this and can tell that whatever it is that's good in Trump is the antidote to it. I think that's right. And I think that is the majority sentiment, and not only in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a lot of work to do, but I don't see the situation as hopeless by any stretch of the imagination. And I also think in many ways, even though we're coming to a kind of crisis because of this election, I think in some ways, the window of what you can now say without being entirely trampled upon by the censorious mob is actually widened to some degree in the last 2 or 3 years. When I started talking about the trans butchery problem, that was the first podcast I did after I was ill for a couple of years, I was terrified to even bring it up. And now that's it's not even controversial to criticize the idea that cutting the breasts off young women is a bad idea. And so that seems to be a substantive improvement. And I would say the same thing has occurred on the climate apocalypse front. I think that battle in some ways is over, is that people now understand that whatever might be going on in the environmental realm, it's being hijacked by bad actors and used to foment the kind of idiot tyrannical policies that have, well, demolished Germany, for example, and put the UK at tremendous risk. So I think we have reason to be optimistic. Now, obviously, this election is a crucial point, and it's going to be a hard struggle forward if whoever the hell is running the show in the United States now manages to continue with their grip. But I don't think Trump is alone, and I don't think he's alone around the world. Even in Great Britain, they just elected a Labour government, and they're censorial to the extreme. But it's not like they're popular. And half the reason they got elected was because it was time to throw the Conservatives out, and they richly deserved it. Having swallowed all that net zero idiocy and tanked the British economy, they needed to be turfed out, but didn't mean the Labour Party was popular. It doesn't mean that they're idiot globalist. So I don't think the situation is dire, even though we're facing a crucial election. I think things could be turned around in relatively short order. That happened in the 1990s. At the beginning of the 1990s, things weren't exactly positive in the US, and your country underwent a boom of unparalleled proportions for about 15 years. And the US certainly has the capacity to do that again. It's done it many times in the past. And things could be set right in comparatively short order if we were fortunate. And I think the Trump team at the moment is arguably composed of the remarkable people who could pull that off. And it would be good for Trump to come out as a clear team player, and also to show everybody that, because he's also elderly, that there are a myriad of competent people around him who can take some of the weight off his shoulders, which would be a good thing, but who could also chart a course for the future. And so there's a lot of truthful communication that Trump enterprise could engage in, highlighting this new transformation in his team, which, like I said, I don't think he's fully come to terms with yet, that could be greatly reassuring to the American populace and maybe turn Let's look at it this way. His performance, Kamala Harris's performance in the last debate exceeded expectations. And so in consequence, technically she won. I didn't think Trump's performance was, what would you say?
It wasn't bad, but it could have been much better. And you've mentioned,
exactly.
like, for example, talking a lot about the team he has around him as one main example.
Exactly. But that pathway is open to him. He could do that. He could say, look, I've gathered some remarkable people around me in a very surprising manner. And he could be pushing that in a manner that made it clear that this wasn't Trump versus the Democrats or Trump versus Harris, but a team of competent and committed people who are with a proven revolutionary track record, who could, in principle, set things right, even by asking the right questions. Like, it's such a miracle to see Kennedy enter the scene. The Trump slogan even morphed into "Make America Healthy Again." I mean, who the hell thought that was on the table? No one. And half of genius is asking the right questions. And Trump's really got that going for him right now. It's really exciting to see. And he can really capitalize on that in the last, we got about 50 days until the election. Like, that could be the theme. He needs to rely a lot more on his team.
It feels a lot like like what we're going to see if we do get a Trump administration. It's going to be a battle between elected and unelected officials. And Bret, I know you're trying to jump in. Just before you do so, Tulsi Gabbard will be joining us within minutes. We're not sure about Charlie Kirk exactly when he is joining, and I'm getting messages in the back channels that Vivek could join. He can pop in and out, apparently. We're just going to get an update on that. But we do have Tulsi Gabbard, who's one of the special guests, coming in a few minutes. Bret, go ahead.
I just want to re-emphasize this, because in every conversation where I see American politics at the presidential level discussed, this gets lost. We have a huge number of people eligible to vote who are tuned in and fed up. All they've got to do is come off the bench in order for Trump to win in a landslide. So I echo Peterson's point about Trump's team, that if Trump can recognize where he is and that this is not a rerun of any past election, that he is now not Trump against this vile enemy, but he is a huge and diverse team of people that he can call upon and he can point to, and that will neutralize people's concerns about him because he's partnered with people who hold a different perspective on issues that they worry about, that's tremendously powerful. And I hope it's not a lot of time before the election happens, and in the US, voting doesn't even happen all on one day anymore. Just simply recognizing where he is on the chessboard, and other people recognizing that this is not a moment for high-minded arguments about why you're too disgusted to vote or why you're going to vote for something that doesn't have a chance of winning. This is the moment to cut that out, to vote for the one thing that is hopeful. And I guess I would add to what Jordan said, the degree to which this moment is hopeful or terrifying it has become strangely binary. If we lose this election, we're in big trouble. If we win this election, there's a tremendous possibility that it's the dawn of a new era.
And Dr. Peterson, you mentioned something earlier. Elon, we posted your clip where you said it'd be very exciting for me to contemplate a Department of Efficiency headed by Elon, as Musk has repeatedly demonstrated his ability to take dysfunctional organizations and reconstitute them, much like Steve Jobs did for Apple. So we've put that whole clip there, and Elon did like it a few minutes ago. Well, this is probably the most historic space we've done in a few months now. I think since the one we had with Elon, Tucker, Alex Jones, Andrew Tate, and Vivek, and a few others. It's been an incredible discussion. I do want to go to Dr. Peterson. I see you unmute, then we'll go to the hands, Dr. Peterson. And just for the audience, we do have Tulsi Gabbard, potentially Vivek and Charlie Kirk joining us within a few minutes. Go ahead, Dr. Peterson.
I don't know if I have much right at the moment to add to what Bret said. I guess the daring part of me is what's optimistic about what's happening around Trump. As I said before, my sense as a psychologist, because I've studied people's capability to perform in different endeavors, is that under normal conditions, you don't necessarily want people of the sort that have gathered themselves around Trump at the moment to run the show. You want administrative, managerial types who tend to work in the background and to implement. But now and then you need the entrepreneurial types to come up and make a radical change. And it looks to me, because things have tilted so badly in many ways across the world in the West, that it's time for some medicine that the entrepreneurial types are perfectly capable of administering. And I know perfectly well from my work as a psychologist that Gabbard, Kennedy, Vivek, Musk, and Trump himself, they're all into entrepreneurial types. They're all creative types. And generally, they would find a more welcoming home on the more liberal end of the political spectrum. But that's not the case now. And that also marks the fact that the issue that Bret pointed to, which is that we're not in ordinary times. And Kennedy said the same thing. The political landscape has shifted in a very strange way, and no one's really figured that out at the moment. But what we do see is that all the entrepreneurial types, the more revolutionary thinkers, and these are highly competent people as well, which is also something to note, they've lined up behind Trump. Because you got to ask yourself, it's like, why the hell aren't Kennedy and Gabbard and Musk with Kamala? Jesus, you could even ask the same thing about Trump himself, right? What's going on? Why are they with the Republicans? That makes no sense. Not under normal times.
I want to go back to the debate that we saw. Jordan, you've talked about Trump's lost opportunity to talk about the team around him. But what are your general thoughts on Trump's performance that day? Why do you think he got triggered by Kamala? What do you think of Kamala's performance, and how big of an impact do you think it will have on the elections? Because we saw on Polymarket, which is a betting platform, before the debate, Trump was winning by 8 percentage points. And then throughout the debate, they went back to 50-50. And now Kamala's at 50, and Trump is at 49, which is pretty much the same.
Look, it's not like Harris showed herself as competent. She showed herself as much less incompetent than her worst detractors had claimed. And that was sufficient at that point to constitute something of a victory. Now, I think one of the things that debate highlighted that no one's really commented on is that I think it humanized Trump to some degree, because he's generally in a debate, he's a swaggering sort of character and he dominates the landscape. And Harris did get under his skin, and she did show a vulnerable side of Trump that I actually think he needs to show some more of. It's important to remember, I think, that Mr. Donald Trump is a 78-year-old man who's been under more stress in the last 10 years than anybody can possibly imagine. He's had the most powerful cabals in the world organized against him to do nothing but harass him and take him out on every possible front. And I watched a man who was somewhat defensive in his posture towards Harris, who is a bag of tricks in many ways, and some of them quite effective. Her derisive, hand-crossing grin at his at his attempts to defend himself and his administration. She did that very effectively. But I saw a part of Trump too that aroused a certain amount of sympathy from me for him. And I also think that sympathy, what would you say, it jives well with the observation that he's now surrounded himself with a team. One of the things that you can say that's a risk about Trump is that he's elderly. When we saw what happened with Biden, that didn't turn out so well. And so one of the things we might be really concerned about is this man who's been through so much, who's he got around him to make sure that the job doesn't kill him or make him deteriorate to the point where we have a situation like the one that we have right now. And now he's got all these great people around him. And so people should be able to rest assured that he's also obviously not afraid to surround himself with A-grade players. Trump is arguably, by some measures, the most famous person in the world, but he's certainly rivaled in that regard by Musk. And yet he seems perfectly willing to ally himself with Musk. And if it was just Musk, you might be skeptical about that and thinking about that as a narcissistic move, but he's also done the same thing with Kennedy, who's no slouch in the public eye, and also with Gabbard and with Vivek. And so this looks good to me. It's put to rest many of the concerns I had about Trump as an individual. When I've dug around behind the scenes too, with regards to Trump, I know many people who've known him and worked with him. I can tell you one of the things they all say is that for them, Trump was a pleasure to work with. Like I talked to somebody this week who I won't name, who works with a very liberal organization, who also worked with Trump, and he said that Trump was a delight to work with. And that isn't what I've heard about Kamala Harris. And one of the things I've learned about managing people is that you can tell a lot from someone by how they treat the people around them, especially when they're in a position of authority. And I've heard nothing but good things about Donald Trump, which belies the idea that he's fundamentally narcissistic, because he is a swaggering guy. But I've heard nothing but terrible things about Harris with regards to the manner that she treats people who are in her immediate orbit. And that's not a positive thing, that's for sure. And I also think that Trump did a relatively poor job of highlighting the degree to which Harris is absolutely uncommitted to her political platform. I mean, he did point to the fact that she flip-flops and wobbles, but that isn't what she does. She radically reverses her position at any point in the process where it appears that doing so will redound to her immediate political credit. And she has supported absolutely absurd things like trans surgery for inmates. Jesus, really? That's a priority? Or even something that you think is reasonable in any universe possibly known to humanity? So he didn't attack her as effectively as he might have, and he didn't defend himself as well as he should have. And he didn't make reference to his team, which was a major mistake. But I don't think that Harris performed well during the debate, and she won't be able to garner the same degree of support for merely not being staggeringly incompetent the second time around. This isn't over, and I don't think what she did will redound to her credit over the medium to long run.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Jordan, you just said something that I think is tremendously important. Many people have, of course, argued that Donald Trump appears to be narcissistic. And I think I have at least thought that's not good, but it's not the worst thing in the world. Somebody who wants to be loved could find their way to being loved by saving a republic that was full of people ready to be grateful for it. But it sounds to me like I know that you can't diagnose somebody who hasn't come into your office and gone through whatever the screening process would be, but informally speaking, you as somebody who knows as much about narcissism as you could because you have your profession, this does not feel like a narcissistic person to you from what you've heard, read, and seen. Is that right?
You're muted, Dr. Peterson, just because your mic was better before, by the way. Not sure if you've changed the mic, but it was better before. We can still hear you fine, though.
Okay, I'm back. I'm back. Look, I've tried to pigeonhole Trump from a personality perspective, and so I'm going to say some things that are pretty obvious, but I think they're worth highlighting anyways. He's very extroverted, like 99th percentile level. And that's actually one of the elements of narcissism. To be narcissistic, you have to be very extroverted and very disagreeable. Those are two of the 5 cardinal personality traits. Now, is Trump disagreeable? Fragments into 2 facets, 2 aspects. One is compassion, and the other is politeness. And liberals tend to be higher in compassion, and conservatives higher in politeness. My sense with Trump, and I know people like him, is that he's high in compassion and low in politeness. And that gives him that kind of attack dog element in keeping with his extroversion. But it also accounts for the fact that he does care for people, and the working class in particular can see that. So he's mouthy and funny and bitter and sardonic and cynical and insanely humorous. And that's well predicted, I would say, by high extroversion and low politeness. But he's also compassionate, and that mitigates against the more toxic forms of narcissism. Politics attracts people who have more narcissistic personality traits because you have to be extroverted to be a politician under most circumstances, and you have to be disagreeable enough to enjoy a certain amount of combat. Okay, so then you might ask, what mitigates against the more pathological elements of narcissism? And I would say high conscientiousness is one. The conscientious people are dutiful and industrious, and they can keep their word. They can keep contracts over a long period of time. Now, you have to remember that Trump has been successful in a multitude of different endeavors across his life, including, let's say, the construction business, which is a very difficult business and also one in which you have to get your hands dirty in the negotiating process. And I've spoken to people for whom Trump has built buildings in major cities like Chicago, hundreds of millions of dollars projects, and finished them on time and under budget. And that's very difficult. And then he wasn't just successful as a builder. He was successful as a builder and a TV personality, and then as a candidate for president, a very unlikely one, and then as president. So he also has a track record. And plus, he hasn't been taken out of the game, regardless of all the stress. And that indicates another personality trait, which is he's low in neuroticism. He really has high stress tolerance. And I'm not concerned about Trump from the personality perspective, certainly not nearly as much as I was the first time that he made a run for the brass ring. And the fact that he's gathered this circle of people around him of very diverse views and has obviously been able to negotiate with them successfully and to pull them into something approximating a coalition and to listen to them also mitigates any concern I might have stemming from he's quite the bull in the china shop on X or on Twitter, he was. And he's got that vicious sense of humor, and he's definitely got that capability to bully. And he nicknames and he demeans his opponents, especially if they go after him. And those are things to watch out for. But my concerns in that regard have been fundamentally allayed by the fact that his presidency was peaceful, which was a complete bloody miracle, by the fact that he negotiated an extraordinarily important peace treaty, even though the State Department said that was impossible, and by the fact that he's gathered this remarkable team around him.
Fantastic.
Good enough, man. Good enough.
And another member of that team, by the way, Bret, not sure if you can see the stage, but we do have Congresswoman Gabbard on stage as well, which is a perfect time because Dr. Peterson, you're just referring to the peace that we had under Trump, relative to what we have today. And I know, Congresswoman, you were critical of Trump's foreign policy, and then your stance has shifted over time. Angela, before we go to Congresswoman Gabbard, I do want to go to you, and I'd love you to introduce Congresswoman as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Welcome, Tulsi Gabbard. We're so excited to have you as part of our team and helping us rescue the Republic. The question that was asked earlier that we've been batting around was, is the Trump administration essentially going to save us? And my perspective on it is this is the leap of faith I was talking about earlier. You have to hope it's enough and use that hope to propel you into action. And then we all work together and we end up pulling ourselves out of trouble. That's like team unity. From my perspective, I really worry that the American dream is at stake right now. And if it fails, then we essentially cease to be the world power that we've been and fully descend into desperation and malevolence as we clamp down with more tyrannical actions in an attempt to hold on to our place. The people who want to hurt us, I think, like the assassination attempt, like whatever is propping up whoever is in charge in the White House right now, I think they're evil on a truly profound level. And maybe we can kick it back to Dr. Peterson after Tulsi talks and shares with us some stuff. But I think about when you wish upon a star, and I think a lot about Dr. Peterson's analysis of Pinocchio. I really feel like the regime that's struggling for power wants to kill the star. And they want to kill our ability to wish upon a star. And that's really why we're uniting with Tulsi Gabbard, with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., with all these amazing people at Rescue the Republic, at the event, and just broadly across the nation and the Western world. So I want to thank you guys so much for supporting this effort that Bret and I are doing. And also, please visit jointheresistance.org.
And Tulsi, it's a pleasure to have you. My question to you, continuing what Angela was saying, is when you talk about rescuing the Republic, we talked about it earlier. Can you expand further on exactly what we're rescuing? What are the existential issues that are being faced right now in the US and the rest of all other democracies, to be honest?
Thank you. It's great to join all of you. Gosh, but both of you have touched on some really important things. And Angela, thanks for really painting such a beautiful picture about what is at stake. And when you talk about wishing upon a star and how they want to destroy the star, I think really when we look at the choice that we have before us as voters, it is a choice between freedom versus tyranny, peace versus war. And when I look at many of my former party leaders, where we look at permanent Washington, we look at the military-industrial complex, we look at all of their allies and puppeteers, they're not so much trying to destroy the star as they want to be the sole authority and arbiters of freedom. They want us to bow to their desires and their greed for more power, and they want total control. Ultimately, that is what it's about.
How are they doing that, Congresswoman? How would you break it down? Free speech, lawfare? Could you break down exactly how
all of them are connected? Of course, this is something that I think there are a number of us here who are on this call, and I think there'll be a number of us speaking at the Rescue the Republic event in Washington, D.C. on September 29th, who've had very direct personal experience in this area. Yes, the censorship of our free speech is now something that, thanks to the expose of the Twitter files and many other...
And the Quiet Skies, I'd love you to expand on the Quiet Skies secret domestic terror list as well you were talking about.
Yes, the level of political retaliation and weaponization of various government agencies and the Department of Justice, the weaponization of, or the use of propaganda media and big tech in this effort to squash free speech is happening in many ways, shapes, and forms. Most recently, and I am not the only target of this, obviously there are many, Donald Trump has been enemy number one in this area for the power elite in Washington that crosses over both parties. But for me, most recently, the very next day after I criticized Kamala Harris specifically about how dangerous she would be as commander-in-chief if she were elected, I was placed on this secret domestic terror watch list called Quiet Skies. It's administered by the Department of Homeland Security and TSA, one that many people have never even heard of, one that members of Congress, at least thus far, to my knowledge, have not been able to gain access to. They've requested, hey, we want to see who is on this list and why. Various leaks and whistleblowers have come forward saying, hey, you have 6-month-old babies on this list. How does that make sense in any world? And in my case, whistleblowers came forward, air marshals, federal air marshals, who were disgusted by the fact that they are being used as pawns to conduct this act that was very obviously one of political retaliation. And they've come forward with evidence and they've presented it to Congress, and it's something that is under investigation right now. But what is the reason for doing this? And it's not only to say, okay, we're going to bully Tulsi Gabbard or try to harass her out of this desire for retaliation, but it is to send a message to the American people that this is who we are, this is the power we have, and you better think twice before you criticize us, because if we're coming after Tulsi Gabbard today, we've come after Bobby Kennedy, we're going after Elon Musk, you will be next. And so they're hoping to have this chilling effect on our country. And quite frankly, in some cases, it's working. I want to talk about the issue that you raised with regard to war and peace. This is very directly connected to the issue of freedom and liberty. We have seen time and time again during a state of war, very often there is this power grab attempt to take away our freedom and our liberty. You go back to World War II and the Japanese internment camps. This hits close to home for us in Hawaii, where people were literally yanked out of their beds or pulled out from their jobs or their schools, Americans, and put into these internment camps, all of their freedoms and liberties taken away simply because of their ethnicity. Not a single one of them by the end of the war were found to have been suspect or spies in any way, shape, or form for the enemy. We saw this with the Patriot Act after 9/11 that's continuing to be used in this most recent reauthorization of the Patriot Act. More and more power grabs. They increase the power of the federal government to further encroach upon our civil liberties, our Fourth Amendment rights, their ability to surveil us without any warrant or any due process on our part. But the list that I'm on is a perfect example that I have no way to say, hey, you are surveilling me, provide the evidence, provide the justification. By law, under this current law, they have no requirement to do that. So when we talk about freedom and the fundamental core issues that are on the line here, we're talking about freedom, we're talking about peace, we're talking about prosperity, we're talking about our ability as Americans to truly live and thrive in a free and peaceful and prosperous society. I want to go back and just clarify a comment that's about President Trump's foreign policy and how my views may have evolved or changed on that. That's not quite accurate. I met with President Trump. I was the first Democrat to do this back in 2016. About 2 weeks after he won the election, I was asked to go and speak with him in Trump Tower in New York City about the Middle East, about the threat of Islamist terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and to share my thoughts about how best we should take action to defeat this threat and how best we should take action to stop waging regime change wars that have time and time again turned out to be quite counterproductive to our own security, both in the sense of our physical safety and security, but also securing our liberties and freedoms. President Trump's instincts when it comes to war has always been and continues to be to stay out of war as much as possible. I think he recognizes that sometimes, unfortunately, war is necessary, but his instinct is to try to avoid that, which is why he went out and did something that President Obama refused to do, and something that President Biden refused to do, and that Kamala Harris would refuse to do, which is to go out and meet with a dictator like Kim Jong-un in North Korea, with the goal of trying to de-escalate tensions and the goal of trying to de-escalate and reduce and minimize the threat of a nuclear attack coming from North Korea. Again, something that hits close to home for us who live in the Indo-Pacific region. So while of course I've had some disagreements with President on certain decisions he's made, as we look to the kind of change that's possible, and I think this really gets to the core of your comments and this conversation about our future that both you and Angela touched on, there are no guarantees in anything in life, but in this election, there is a very clear choice. And I endorsed President, and I will do all that I can to help him get elected, because in this election, he is our best hope to bring about this change, to root out the corruption that exists within our government, and to truly defend our freedom against those who are constantly assaulting it and trying to take that freedom away, and to walk us back from the brink of the many wars that we are embroiled in currently because of the Harris-Biden administration, walk us back from the brink of the likelihood of World War III and nuclear Armageddon, which is where we sit today, now closer to the prospect of nuclear war than we ever have been before in history, according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. It takes more than one person to do this. It's going to take all of us as Americans making sure that we lift our voices about how essential these things are to us as Americans, regardless of political party or persuasion or how we may agree or disagree on other issues. Fundamentally, if we do not have the freedom to criticize our own government without fear of political retaliation, if we don't have the freedom to have debates about different issues in the public square, whether that be in person or a virtual public square like this, then nothing else matters. If we find ourselves in a state of nuclear war and nuclear Armageddon, we will have no life. We will have no environment to protect. We will have no freedom. We will face the annihilation of humanity. Again, looking at the core and fundamental issues where we all should be able to agree upon, which of, again, the promise that our founders, the hope that our founders had for us, that we do have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a very practical application. That's not a lofty dream. There's a practical application that exists behind those words And in this election, uniquely, we've got an opportunity to get back on track as we strive towards those goals.
Congressman, I've just got a question. I've got too many comments to make, but one important one here, just talking about the war in Ukraine. I posted something today about Russia threatening to cut the internet cables, the undersea internet cables that will impact pretty much all of the West. And what's fascinating is that someone who's going to potentially be on Trump's administration, Elon, replies to that tweet saying Starlink will still work. So essentially, you've got someone who's not even part of the government that will be offering a solution to a problem one could argue is being caused by the current administration, which is the escalation of the war and potentially Ukraine striking deep into Russian territory with NATO weapons. And you've got a neighbor to the US, you've got Brazil, where free speech is being attacked by Justice Moraes. And the person that stood up to this is not the Biden administration, Elon, fighting those censorship requests with X and Starlink offering everyone internet. So you've got someone who's not even in the administration yet, in my opinion, doing more to fight for peace, doing more to fight for free speech than the current administration. But my question to you, Congresswoman, is Trump's comments about ending the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Now, ignore the 24 hours, that could mean days. But have you spoken to Trump about details, President Trump, on how he would end the war? I know it's a very difficult question, but have you got a rough idea of how he would achieve that?
I think it would be, first of all, I can't speak for him, but he has shown through his approach, and he's talked about this just during this campaign, how has just about every war come to an end? You have to bring the parties to the table and you have to negotiate some form of a settlement or a treaty or an end to the war. And that's what President Trump has said that he'll do. And he may have talked about this in the debate. If not, it was in another venue recently where he will speak with Zelensky, he will speak with Putin, he will speak with other parties who are concerned and negotiate a settlement in order to bring about an end to this war as quickly as possible. That is truly what is in the best interest of the people of Ukraine and in the interest of peace and in the interest of we, the American people, and people everywhere in the world to begin that process to walk us back from the brink of World War III and nuclear war.
And the next question is talking about the debate between President Trump and Vice President Harris. I would love to get your general thoughts on the debate. Dr. Peterson, who's on stage with us, made a very interesting observation that Trump could have focused more on the team around him, including yourself, Mr. Kennedy, Elon. That was a very strong argument. All of them actually, everyone mentioned, and were formerly Democrats. Would love to get your thoughts on how the debate went and how big of an impact do you think it will have on the election?
First of all, these debates, when you talk about impact, having been on that stage a number of times, it's become just political theater and a game that's created by the propaganda media for their ratings. And it's been something that it takes a presidential election, which is a very serious thing for us as voters to decide who we...
It just chopped out, and I do want to go to Bret in the meantime. That same question, because I haven't gotten your thoughts much, Bret, until the Congresswoman is back her mic is back or connection is back. Congresswoman, your mic isn't working. But that same question to you, Bret, just the performance of the debate and how big of an impact do you think it will have on the election?
It's a really strange question. I obviously wish the debate had gone differently than it did. I have talked on the Dark Horse podcast about what I suspect went into Kamala Harris's, I think, very surprising performance. But at some level, I'll return to the same point I made earlier. Most of the electorate that we think of are people who are already committed one way or the other. And it would be lovely if we could win some people over from the blue team, if we could wake them up to what their team has become and alert them to the fact that what exists over on the red team is not what they have been led to believe. But even failing that, there is this huge collection of voters who simply need to return to the electorate in order to make this a decisive victory for this clear unity movement that is collecting around Donald Trump. There's no reason not to do it. If it turned out that it didn't work, it would be cheap from the perspective of those voters. But if it turns out to function, as I think it would be a moment, it would be a historical sea change, and one that, if you listen to what Tulsi just told us, we are facing a moment of nuclear peril that exceeds any in our past. I have reached the same conclusion, and Not only that, but we do not have towering patriotic figure at the helm to navigate through those dangerous waters. We don't even know who's in charge. We know that the president was forced out of the race by a vice president who is now vying for the position. She threatened the president with the 25th Amendment and then did not invoke it in order to protect the republic from a president who is no longer capable of managing the responsibilities of the office. How much clearer does it have to be that the blue team is not serious about governance? They are serious about gaining power and maintaining it. And we have a patriotic obligation to drive them from office. At the point we've done that, the question about what we do to put the republic back together is an interesting question. But until we do, I just see this as maybe unfortunately very simple. We have to win, and we have to win by a decisive margin so that no level of cheating is capable of overcoming it.
Sarah, you've got a question for Congresswoman?
Yes, Congresswoman, is your mic working at this time?
Just bottom left corner, Congresswoman, you can unmute it. I think a question I'm fascinated by, I know you've answered it, Congresswoman, is why did you leave the Democratic Party? And how would you compare the Democratic Party today to the Democratic Party you supported previously? But let's see if Congresswoman's mic is working. Until your mic is working, Congresswoman, it's bottom left corner. If it doesn't work, you can drop down and bring you back up. Dr. Peterson, I know David's got a question for you. David, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
wow.
It was... Go
Oh,
ahead.
you're there, Congresswoman. You're there. Can you hear me?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Sarah, you've got a question for Congresswoman?
Sorry, guys.
Yes.
I've been talking for the last 5 minutes and I didn't realize I was on mute. That's my fault.
What did we miss? What did we miss? What did we
I'm
miss,
sorry.
Congresswoman?
I
What
feel
did we
silly
miss?
now.
What did we miss though?
Essentially, I'll sum it up. I'll sum it up as to say Kamala Harris, the Washington elite, the propaganda media create these debates as political theater with a false premise for the American people that we should somehow believe when a candidate wins a debate that automatically qualifies them to be president. That's what they want us to believe, which is pretty insulting to us as voters. And when you look at how Kamala Harris prepared, she rehearsed her scripted lines very well. The whole thing, ABC, the moderators, they did their part to try to help create this scenario where Kamala Harris would win this debate, would get her headlines. And the thing that I think is very telling is that voters are not as stupid as they think they are, because even as the quick polls that came out in the wake of the debate showed that even voters who felt Kamala Harris won the debate, it did not translate into a correlation to voters now being convinced that they would vote for her. In fact, President Trump is leading in every single battleground state in the country, according to the most recent polls. There's hope in this election, and this is where it's not just a call to action in what we're trying to do, but really to all of us as Americans, is to remind voters about the obvious choice. This is not about Democrats versus Republicans, and this kind of goes to your point, Mario, and Jordan's point earlier, that this is not the binary choice between which team are you on and team loyalty. It's about our country. It's about the American people. It's about the choice between freedom, peace, and prosperity, or tyranny, war, and economic hardship. And the fact that President Trump has very independent-minded people around him, the support of people like myself and Bobby Kennedy and others, who we are not in lockstep on every issue. We have very different ideas on how we should tackle different problems. But none of that matters, because we are coming together around the most important things in those issues that I've raised, and the need to bring about a government that actually upholds the Constitution and is centered around how do we best serve the interests of the American people and our country first. Contrast that with the other choice. Again, President Trump and Kamala Harris both have very clear records. You don't have to guess about what they will do as leaders, given they've both served in the White House in different roles over the last over two different 4-year terms. But again, on the issue of war and peace, you look at the fact that Kamala Harris and the Democrats are celebrating Dick Cheney's support and endorsement of Kamala Harris, Liz Cheney's support, Adam Kinzinger's support. What's the thing that they all have in common? These are the warmongers of Washington, Dick Cheney, of course, being the leader among them, and the architect of not only the wars in the Middle East that have destroyed the Middle East, but also these wars that we're seeing around the world through his decades and decades of time in politics in Washington. And so it's a clear choice. We have the opportunity to bring about historic change in this election, not for one party or another party or one person or another person, but for us, for the people. And I sincerely hope that we're able to get this message to voters and we make this happen.
Sarah?
Thank you so much. Congresswoman Gabbard, my question to you is, since leaving the Democratic Party, what fundamental changes would the Democrats have to make within their party for you to ever consider coming back, if ever?
That's a good question that I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, primarily because I tried for years to bring about the kind of change that I think would be necessary, that I know was necessary and continues to be necessary in the Democratic Party, and was confronted with not only a lack of interest in bringing about change that would make it so that today's Democrat Party is more like the party of JFK, is more like the party of Martin Luther King Jr., the party that I joined over 20 years ago. So what are those things, Sarah? Specifically, it is a party that once again stands up for free speech and is willing to not only welcome people with different views and ideas, but stand up and defend the right to free speech for those who may have very different ideas. The Democratic Party is not only not willing to do that, they are doing the exact opposite. You can see how, and this really makes me sad, how there are some of my former colleagues in the Democratic Party who, even when I was there, would join me in standing up on the issues related to peace and civil liberties, who largely are now completely conforming to the warmongering elite who are leading the Democratic Party of today, who don't care about peace and who don't care about civil liberties and are willing to sacrifice those things in their pursuit of power. There's a whole list of things. This is why I wrote my book, For Love of Country, Leave the Democrat Party Behind. It's not a laundry list of issues per se. It is each chapter dedicated to what I saw as the biggest problems with today's Democrat Party, how harmful their actions and their actions are and continue to be for us as a society and for the American people. And that ultimately drove me to leave the Democratic Party. I encourage you to read the book for those who are interested or those who have friends who don't quite know what to do. Maybe they're still in the Democratic Party or thinking about leaving. If the fundamental Democratic Party would have to go back to its roots, where it once was, of being the party that actually stood up for what is in the Constitution rather than going against it. It would need to become a party that it once was in standing up for peace. Unfortunately, it's become a party that has rejected all of those things, rejects objective truths about biological facts and differences between men and women, and a whole host of other things. Unfortunately, given the leadership of today's Democrat Party, given the fact that they don't even believe in democracy, we looked at the so-called Democratic primary in this presidential election where, they wouldn't let Bobby Kennedy or any of the other candidates, quite frankly, they wouldn't allow any debates to happen. They wouldn't even allow them on the ballot in many of these states. They wouldn't even hold primary elections. The Democrat Party of today would have to go a very long way to be able to regain the trust of people like me. And I meet people almost every single day I was at a rally with President Trump last night in Las Vegas, and I lost track of how many people who were there at the rally to support Trump, including elected officials, Nevada elected officials, who came up to me and said, I have walked the same path as you. I used to be a Democrat. Some left the Democrat Party a long time ago. Others have left more recently. But there are a lot of people who are really quite disgusted by the insanity, unfortunately, of today's Democrat Party and don't see any hope because they don't allow anyone to speak up. They don't allow any counter narrative. They don't allow anyone to come in and say, hey, the Democrat Party is headed in the wrong direction. Here is how I want to change it. They will, as they did to me and Bobby Kennedy at their first opportunity, the Hillary Clintons of the Democrat Party will do all that they can to smear and destroy and censor and silence anyone who dares to do that.
So I know that when you left...
I've got probably time for one last question.
I just wanted to follow up very quickly on that. I know that when you left the party, that you did face a lot of criticism, likely from your colleagues in Congress. Did that same criticism come from family and friends? As we have seen with many Democrats that have left the party, it has torn them apart with family, with friends, and with colleagues. Did you experience that same thing that others have experienced as well?
Yeah, Sarah, I have. And it's really quite sad that this is the state of, I was going to say the state of politics, but it's really not that broad. It is largely what I experienced coming from people in the Democratic Party and people who are bought into what the Democrat Party is selling today, where people who I had disagreements with, for example, friends of mine, family members of mine about different policies who are also fellow Democrats at the time, we could have those conversations and share our thoughts and views and how they differed and why we disagreed. And then we could go out and have dinner, or we could continue to have a conversation, or we could maintain that respect and care and friendship, or for me, in the case of some friends and family members, that love for each other, even though we disagreed, because we knew that our intent came from a place of actually caring for others, caring for the people, caring for our country. And unfortunately, that has just completely changed. And the first time that I experienced it was actually not when I left the Democratic Party, but it was in 2016 when I went and met with President Trump. And I did not expect to get the kind of response that I got from some family members, from some close friends, from some of my former colleagues, where quite literally in the time that it took me to walk from Trump Tower after meeting with him, where we had a great, very substantive foreign policy conversation for about an hour, just he and I was sitting across the desk from him in his office. From the time it took me to walk from Trump Tower to get to my hotel room, less than 5 minutes, my phone was blowing up with hate mail and hate messages from people who, quite frankly, it surprised me to hear from. And the central thread that seemed to be consistent through many of these attacks and very emotional messages that I got that were angry and hateful and hurtful was, how dare you meet with Donald Trump? How dare you humanize him? And that's what really struck me about a lot of things, how dangerous that mindset is, and how people could, for me, when I was asked to go and meet with him, I said, of course, I'm going to take the opportunity to meet with this person who was just elected by the American people and who would very soon be our president and commander in chief. It would be a dereliction of duty on my part, both as a member of Congress, as a soldier, as a citizen of this country, if I were asked to meet with any president, any person who had just been elected. Of course, I'm going to take the opportunity to share my thoughts and views about the issues that are most concerning to me. And the fact that people who were close to me at that time, or people who I worked with, or people who knew like why I ran for Congress in the first place, which is largely because of my experiences and seeing and experiencing firsthand the cost of war and how important these decisions are that are being made by the leaders of our country, foremost among them our President Commander-in-Chief. All of that they were blind or somehow had amnesia to all of that, and instead were in full attack mode. And yes, there were some family members of mine who stopped talking to me, and friends who cut off friendships, all because I met with Donald Trump. Wow. And this is unfortunate. It's very sad, but this is what the Democrat Party of today has become. The party that to me used to be rooted in some very important principles and values. All of that's gone out the window now because they see Donald Trump as the greatest threat to their power, because he doesn't kiss the ring of the Washington establishment and he doesn't play their game. All of this comes back to this. Again, we face serious challenges, more so than in any other election I've experienced in my life. But I am an optimist and I am hopeful. And so with these greatest challenges comes the greatest opportunity, perhaps the most historic one, to really bring together people who love our country and the American people and who are willing to fight in the trenches of politics and Washington in order to completely change the deep state, the military industrial complex, the healthcare industrial complex across the board. We really have a great opportunity. This is our best opportunity, and President Trump is our best hope to do that in this election. Thank you all for your time. I've got to over. I'm going to see Bobby Kennedy here in a few minutes at the first event we're doing in a Reclaim America tour. We are in Glendale, Arizona. We'll be in Las Vegas next Saturday, and I believe Charlotte, North Carolina, the last Saturday of September. More dates to come in October. We're going to be doing a lot of events together. We'll be doing a lot of events separately, but stay tuned. Would love to see you all. And I'm very much looking forward to the Rescue the Republic event in Washington, D.C. I hope everyone comes out and joins us there. Thank you to Angela and all of the organizers who are Bret. Thank you for taking this on and for your leadership in bringing together all Americans who cherish peace and freedom and who love our country. Thanks, everybody. Thank you,
Thank you, Tulsi. We'll see you in Washington.
Brad, I'll give you the mic just quickly for the audience. We have more special guests that are coming in. Kyle, I see your hand up as well, Kyle. More special guests coming in as well. Zach will try to jump in. Not sure what the latest update is there, but we have more special guests on this historic space. Brett, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow on to what Tulsi Gabbard said. This really is a extremely broad coalition. I know Angela has worked hard with President Trump, and he has agreed to put a libertarian in his cabinet. So that tells you something also about the number of different factions and ideologies that are represented in this large coalition. And I guess I would just advise that people start with a fresh sheet of paper. If you think you've seen this movie before, I don't think so. I think this is a brand new political opportunity. And if you're sick and tired of living in a nightmare, adds new chapters every day where something else is out of control, some other institution is telling you lies, wouldn't you prefer to live in a movie where you don't know which member of the dream team is going to deliver some new insight or plan or approach to addressing these critical problems of Western civilization? I know that I can imagine living in that world, and I also know that it could be as close to us as January. So I really hope people will see that this is not just another version of failure. This is a real opportunity, and the only thing it depends on is whether you motivate and you can get other people to see the opportunity and for them to motivate. It's really within our grasp.
Thank you for that.
Sorry,
I'm sorry,
Angela. Go ahead,
Angela.
Angela. I think David had a question as well. Go ahead, Angela.
I just want to encourage people, if you want to see our full lineup, to go to jointheresistance.org, where you can read all about the pillars, see all the other awesome speakers who we hope will come to one of Mario's spaces again before our event. And also, please give. It costs a ton to put together this event. Bret is modest. He has worked his butt off to help us make this happen. And we are on the phones nonstop, getting people to donate and help us. So please support us. And thank you guys again for hosting us and giving us such an incredible boost.
It's a pleasure, Angela. David?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Dr. Peterson a question. And we've heard a lot from a lot of different voices. And we've been hearing, in my mind, what I'm seeing is almost like a snowball. And I wanted to ask the Congresswoman before she left, but it's still applicable. There was a lot of people upset about government overreach during COVID, about mask mandates and lockdowns. And there was a lot of people started going, wait a second, this is a little bit more government than I like. And it was a bipartisan sort of concern. Then going forward from COVID, we saw what a lot of people on the right would call an abuse of the Justice Department. Then we've seen censorship of speech, or at least the attempted censorship of speech. It seems like we're snowballing from what we thought was bad with COVID to where we are now. Dr. Peterson, I'm wondering, is this going to continue, or is it my perception? But does it seem like it's getting worse?
I think whatever, it's getting faster, maybe, rather than worse. The dynamic that we're seeing isn't new. There have been victimizer narratives since the beginning of time. And when everybody gets bitter and resentful about the successful, which is something, for example, underlying the flourishing of anti-Semitism now, when everybody gets bitter and resentful about the successful and capitalize on that narrative, then that's the pathway to perdition, and it has been since the beginning of time. I think part of the reason it's intensifying right now is because of the rate of the battle is intensifying because our technological ability has transformed so dramatically. And so things that would happen over 10 years now happen in 6 months. And in 5 years, it'll be happening in 3 months. And we're not exactly prepared for that. We don't have the governance structures in place yet to deal with it. So I'm not as pessimistic as I indicated earlier as I might be, because I've seen changes. Even the tenor of conversation that's occurring within this space, for example, is something that's unprecedented and that wouldn't have occurred a couple of years ago. We see a transformation of approach on the Republican side and a widespread appeal of that. And I see similar things happening all across the Western world. So the situation is by no means hopeless. We're seeing this battle that we're seeing, though, as I said earlier, it shouldn't be construed precisely in political terms. It's not exactly right versus left. It's capture of the communication networks by the psychopathic manipulators. And I think at the moment they're much more effective in manipulating the left. We've certainly seen that manifested in the outbreak of these insane campus protests that were so egregiously pathological that the leader of Iran himself congratulated the American universities on their participation in the co-opting. Battle's not over yet. There are a lot of good things in front of us. Remember, we've lifted a substantial proportion of the world out of poverty in the last 20 years. Well, that's a major accomplishment. And everywhere around the world, signs of industrialization and a movement towards a much, much higher standard of living. We can educate people at a scale that was never before possible. There's a lot of reasons to be positive. That isn't to say that this is a crucial election, but the situation is by no means cut and dried, and I think it's actually better in some ways than it was 2 years ago.
Dr. Peterson, what are your thoughts on something that concerns me a lot is the breakdown of trust in the systems that allow our democracy to function. That one is something that alarms me. And that goes on both sides of the aisle.
Oh yeah, that's a terrible thing, because after lengthy consideration with regard to exactly that issue, I've more or less concluded that the only genuine natural resource is trust. Societies where people trust one another are rich. Japan's a good example. Japan is natural resource free, but it's a very high trust society. It's a very civilized place. And by civilized, I mean in this non-relativistic manner, is that you can trust that people aren't going to steal from you, for example, and generally that they're going to keep their word in any given negotiation. And that means that simplifies the transactions between people immensely and reduces their cost, reduces the risk to the point where true cooperation is possible. And I think that human beings are perfectly capable of making even the most unproductive desert bloom if they can cooperate. Now, what's breaking down trust? For me, the reason that trust is breaking down is because the underlying nature of Western civilization has been under such a protracted assault that we're uncertain about our fundamental axioms. So I think that's what's happening is not even so much a culture war as something like a religious war. And the dimensions of that are not, I've been trying to write about that. I have a new book coming out in November that deals with that specifically, trying to drill down into the culture war to find out what the underlying what's the underlying dynamic. And I made some reference to that earlier. The victim-victimizer narrative, which is as old as the story of Cain and Abel, plays a role. And that the psychopathic manipulators, as I said, already capitalize on that. And so when they get the upper hand in the communication sphere, which is a technological problem now, that makes everything radically unstable in exactly the way that it has become. But I think this is a problem that we can solve. For all the bad things that are confronting us, not least because of our technological transformations, there are unbelievable opportunities that are resting at our fingertips. Immense transformations in computational power. Everyone in the world virtually has or will have access to that computational technology that makes mass communication possible. That means we can spread pathologies like mad, but it also means we can educate people at a scale that was never before imagined. I hope that we can return to the fundamental axioms that made pre-Western civilization the immense force for good that it has been. And I also hope that we can come to some more profound understanding about just what those axiomatic presuppositions have to be. Bret talked earlier about many people did, about the necessity for free speech and political statement in the most profound sense, because there isn't any difference technically between free speech and thought. And so to be an enemy of free speech means that you're an enemy of thought, and to be an enemy of thought means either that you think your way of thinking is the right way and the only way, or you believe that thought itself isn't necessary for civilizations or individuals to progress in the face of an uncertain world. That's a preposterous claim. And what the West did in large part was to, what would you say, establish as an axiomatic certainty the intrinsic value of each individual and promote the notion that free communication was the best bet for everyone, because everyone, given their indefinite intrinsic value, had something valid to bring to the table. And if you have that marketplace of ideas, then the bad ideas can emerge and be dispensed with and criticized out of shape, or what would you say, out of commission, and the good ideas can rise to the top. And it's clearly the case, and maybe even more so now than ever, that the US has been better at that than any other place, which accounts for its continued economic supremacy. And the case that the Trump team needs to make, and is making at least to some degree, is that we were on the right track with regards to all of that, and we need to bolster it and continue it and not lose faith. Now, you see that faith being sorely tried all around the world. Australia, Europe, the UK, particularly, you see it faltering in Canada. That doesn't mean that the battle's over by any stretch of the imagination, or that we were wrong in our initial supposition. Now, the universities have been a very destructive force in that regard with their idiot postmodernism and their turn towards a kind of neo-Marxism. But I think that's also starting to sort itself out in the intellectual realm too, is that we've started to technically understand exactly what the postmodernists got right and what they got wrong and how that might be rectified. And I see that the information that pertains to that philosophical sorting out also starting to become disseminated in a manner that's not only broad, but that's quite heartening to people. You know, let me tell you a quick story just to drive this point home in a variety of ways. Near the end of the Exodus saga, when Moses has led his people through the desert, so they're lost, right? They've escaped tyranny. They're lost in their direction. They're moving towards something better. They've almost attained their goal. And Moses sends out scouts into the future, so into Canaan itself, to determine the possibility of Israelite success in this new land. And the scouts are basically in two teams, and one team comes back and says, oh my God, it's hopeless. The future is populated by giants. The land of Canaan will never defeat them. They're completely beyond us. The entire desert enterprise was a waste of time. The leaders who brought us here were corrupt and power mad. We should have stuck with the tyranny. And the other scouts come back and say, look, the future is a complicated place and there's going to be obstacles to overcome. But if we maintain our upward orientation and our covenant with the divine, if we speak words of truth and we trust each other, there's nothing that we can't manage, and the future is ours. And it's the faithful scouts of the future who lead the Israelites into the promised land. And on the renewal side, so let's speak about the Republican team, it's necessary for the faithful scouts of the future to maintain that courageous faith. It's another thing that Trump didn't do well in the debate. He didn't put forward this radically positive vision of possibility that he has at hand as a consequence of partnering with these remarkable people. Instead of savaging the Democrats, which they richly deserve, let's say, and which I can understand he would do because he's being demonized and attacked so viciously and badly, he could have outlined this shining city on the hill that his remarkable people have in fact built in their own lives and could realistically bring to a much larger segment of the world. And so Trump needs to concentrate on his team and to show what that formulation of that team means for his character. And he needs to elaborate out the kind of positive vision that Kennedy dreams of with regards to a much healthier population, or that Musk dreams of in relationship to a technologically sophisticated civilization that's efficient in its industrial acts and efficient and daring in its industrial actions. That's right there for the Trump team. He's got the pieces in place. And that way he could steal the thunder from the Harris team that are concentrating so shallowly, although somewhat positively, on joy. Some positive emotion would be nice, but maybe we could ally that to policies that actually exist and to a team that could actually deliver something approximating a positive future. And Trump has that.
Bret, I saw you give it a thumbs up, and then we'll go to the handshake. I'll go to you first. I know you've got questions for Dr. Peterson and Bret as well. Bret, you've got any comments before we go to the handshake?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Bret.
I sure do. The first thing to say is I agree completely with you, Jordan, that this is there for the, I don't want to say taking, but for the wielding of Donald Trump if he can see it. And maybe the point is that it is really up to us to make that plain so that he can see what is in front of him and use it to all of our advantage. I also want to echo the stark contrast between what is in fact an extremely bright future and some very dark possibilities if we don't succeed in the next, 50 days. And then the final thing I'll say is that the sense that you were talking about, maybe things aren't getting worse, but they're getting bad faster. Whichever it is, what I believe is going on as somebody who has spent his adult life thinking of and working on game theory is that we are in the end game. Whatever it is that is targeting our freedoms is making a break for it. And what that means is that either it's desperate or it only has a few pieces left to put into place. And it doesn't matter which of those possibilities it is or whether it's both of them. We have no choice but to repel that force at this point. And I guess I would say one more thing. I know I said that was the last. I am a secular-minded person. I've spent my career studying Darwinism and nature. When I hear that we are in a spiritual battle, it resonates with me very profoundly. And I'm sure I could retell that in some way that would defend it from the point of view of a secular materialist, but I think there's no point in it. Even somebody with as secular a mindset as mine knows that this is an existential spiritual battle, and that is the toolkit that we need to be wielding in order to find our courage and confront this at the force that will be necessary to win.
Two things, and I'll be brief. Mr. Weinstein said earlier, we are gathering in defense. Ephesians says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. I agree with Dr. Peterson. This is an unprecedented conversation that needs to be heard and needs to be had. And there's something in the heart, and I know we're coming to the end of this conversation, but there's something that feels like we need to do better.